Hey friends! Glad you're here at Eldritch Potter. We've cooked up something special. Harry found the lost Potter-Black-Peverell-Ravenclaw rings at age 8 and became King of Magical Britain. Liking and subscribing really helps us out. Okay, story time. Chapter 1. The root cellar. The oak tree at the back of Mrs. Fig's garden had been dead for 3 years, but nobody had gotten around to removing it. It stood at the boundary between her property and the narrow strip of wasteland behind Privet Drive, a grey, skeletal thing with roots that had buckled the earth around its base into ridges and hollows, like the knuckles of a buried fist. Harry had hidden behind it before. Not often, Mrs. Fig didn't like children running through her garden, and she had a way of appearing in doorways at inconvenient moments, but when Dudley's gang was particularly motivated, the options narrowed quickly. Today they were very motivated. There he is. By the fence. Harry didn't look back. Looking back was how you tripped. He cut left around the rosebushes, vaulted a low garden wall he'd memorized 2 summers ago, and pelted across the dry summer grass toward the old oak, because the wasteland beyond it was the one place Dudley never followed. Dudley didn't like getting his trainers muddy. Piers Polkiss, unfortunately, had no such concerns. Harry reached the tree with about 4 seconds to spare, ducked around the massive trunk, and put his back to the bark. His heart was slamming. He could hear Piers crashing through the rosebushes and swearing, which bought another few seconds at least. He looked down. The roots had shifted since the last time he'd been here. One of the great lateral roots had heaved upward, splitting the ground beside it, and where the earth had broken open there was a gap, a dark rectangular space about the size of a large suitcase, dropping down into cool shadow. Not a hole exactly. More like a room that had always been there, waiting for the ground to get out of the way. Piers hit the fence. Harry dropped into the gap. The earth closed around him, not literally, not in any way he could explain afterward, but the sounds from above became muffled and distant, the summer heat cut off like a switched lamp, and he found himself standing on a floor of packed earth about 6 feet below ground level. The space was roughly rectangular, maybe 8 feet by 6, with walls of dark soil threaded through with roots. Thin lines of light came down through the gap above. Enough to see by. And on the floor, arranged in a neat row as though someone had set them out this morning, were 4 rings. Harry stood very still. They didn't glow. They didn't hum. They didn't do anything dramatic at all. They just sat there in the dirt, 4 rings of different metals and sizes, each one distinct, each one completely at odds with the idea that they'd been buried in a root cellar under a dead oak tree in Little Whinging, Surrey. The first was gold, warm and slightly reddish, the kind of gold that looks like it came from a fire rather than a mine. Simple band, no stone, but engraved on the outer face with something that wasn't quite a pattern, more like 2 letters overlapping, AP and something older beneath it. The second was silver, or close to silver, darker than sterling, with a slight blue-gray cast, like metal that had spent a long time in moonlight. The band was broader, heavier, and the engraving on it was a family crest Harry didn't recognize, something with a chevron and what might have been a dog, or a wolf, rendered in a style that felt older than anything he'd ever seen. The third stopped his breath. It was a plain band of dark stone, not metal at all, or not entirely, because it had a faint metallic sheen where the light caught it, but the body of it was gray-black stone, smooth and cool-looking. Set into it was a flat stone face, dark as coal, and scratched into that face in lines so fine they might have been made with a needle was a symbol he'd seen in dreams, a triangle containing a circle, bisected by a vertical line. The fourth was bronze, or something close to bronze, threaded through with veins of deep blue that caught the light in a way that made Harry think of deep water rather than gemstone. The engraving on this one was dense, tiny, precise script that covered the entire outer surface of the band in a continuous line that wound around and around without beginning or end. Harry crouched down in front of them. The dirt was cool under his knees. Above him, he could hear Piers shouting his name in a half-hearted way, the way people shout when they're mostly hoping you'll answer so they can find you, not because they're actually looking. He should have been thinking about Piers. He should have been thinking about how to get home without being seen. He should have been thinking about the fact that he was crouching in a hole in the ground and had no idea how he'd gotten in here or how he'd get out. He reached for the gold ring. The moment his fingers closed around it, something happened that he would spend years trying to describe accurately and never quite manage. It wasn't pain and it wasn't warmth and it wasn't sound, though it had elements of all three. It was more like recognition, the specific, gut-level jolt of recognizing a face in a crowd, except what he was recognizing wasn't a person. It was himself. Some version of himself that was older and louder and took up considerably more space, pressing up against the inside of his chest like it had always been there, waiting for the right door to open. The ring slipped onto the middle finger of his right hand as though it had been sized for him. He picked up the silver ring. Same sensation, different register, cooler, more deliberate, like stepping out of a warm room into sharp night air. A clarity that was almost uncomfortable, the way very cold water is almost uncomfortable. It settled on the ring finger of his right hand. The stone ring he held for a long moment before he put it on. It was lighter than it looked, and when he held it up to the thin light from above he could see that the triangle circle line symbol was cleaner than he'd thought, almost perfect, like something mathematical. He put it on the middle finger of his left hand, and the world went briefly, quietly sideways. Not dizziness. More like the sensation you get when you realize a magic trick has been performed on you and you still can't see the method, the specific vertigo of understanding that the world has more seams in it than you previously thought. It passed in a second. He was still himself, still crouching in the dirt, still wearing a too large t-shirt that had once belonged to Dudley. Nothing had changed. Everything had changed. The bronze ring went on the ring finger of his left hand, and the writing on its surface seemed to shift as he looked at it, the tiny script rearranging into something that almost resolved into words before settling back into pattern. He felt it as a kind of sharpening, like his eyesight had improved, except it wasn't his eyesight. It was something behind his eyesight. The way he processed what he saw. Harry sat back on his heels and looked at his hands. 4 rings. Both hands. Each one fitting perfectly, sitting against his skin like they'd been there forever. Potter. Piers, still somewhere above and to the left, sounding bored now. Bored was good. Bored meant leaving. Harry looked up at the gap above him, the split in the earth between the roots, and thought, up, and found himself standing at ground level without any memory of climbing. He stood in the thin shade of the dead oak and watched Piers Polkiss disappear through a gap in the fence, hands in his pockets, clearly deciding Harry wasn't worth the muddy trainers. Harry watched him go and felt nothing about it. Not relief, not triumph, not the usual low-grade anxiety about whether they'd be waiting around the next corner. Just nothing. Quiet. He looked down at his hands. In the afternoon light the rings were more visible, the gold one especially, catching the sun in a way that seemed slightly excessive for plain metal. He thought, in a distant sort of way, that he probably shouldn't walk home wearing 4 obviously magical rings on his hands in broad daylight. He thought about taking them off. He couldn't. Not in the sense of being physically prevented. He tried the gold one experimentally and it moved easily enough on his finger, up to the second knuckle, before he stopped. The inability wasn't physical. It was more that the idea of removing them felt structurally wrong, the way stepping off a moving train feels structurally wrong. Not impossible. Just something that would require you to stop being yourself first. Harry pulled the cuff of Dudley's too large t-shirt down over his left hand and made a fist with his right so the rings were mostly hidden by his curled fingers, and he walked home. Number 4, Privet Drive looked the same as it always did, aggressively normal, the lawn trimmed to within a millimeter of its life, the car in the drive polished to a mirror shine. Vernon's car, which meant Vernon was home early, which meant the kitchen would have that particular quality of pressurized silence that preceded someone being shouted at. Harry came in through the back door and moved quietly toward the stairs. Boy! He stopped. Vernon Dursley was standing in the kitchen doorway, arms folded, face in the configuration that usually preceded either a punishment or a lecture, and occasionally both delivered simultaneously. He was looking at Harry the way he always looked at Harry, with a baseline contempt that had been refined over 8 years into something almost professional. Except Vernon's expression did something small and strange. His eyes dropped to Harry's hands, just for a moment, before Harry had time to think about it, and something shifted in his face. Not fear, not quite. Something more like the instinctive physical awareness of a large animal when it senses something it doesn't recognize in its territory. The kind of awareness that bypasses the thinking mind entirely. "You're late," Vernon said. "I was in the garden," Harry said. The word garden was technically true in the loosest geographical sense. Vernon looked at him for another moment, that strange, not quite fear still moving behind his eyes, and then he unfolded his arms and stepped back into the kitchen. "Dinner's in an hour," he said, in the tone of someone who has decided, for reasons they don't fully understand, not to press the issue. "Don't be late for that." Harry went upstairs. He sat on the edge of his camp bed in the cupboard under the stairs and looked at his hands in the thin strip of light from under the door. The rings caught even that pale light and did something with it, not glowing, nothing so obvious, just a quality of presence that seemed slightly outsized for their physical reality. He thought about what had happened in the root cellar. He thought about the moment the gold ring had slid onto his finger, the recognition, the sense of a door opening somewhere inside him. He thought about the symbol on the stone ring, the one he'd seen in dreams he'd never been able to describe. Then he thought about something practical, because the rings had done something to the way he thought, not made him smarter exactly, but stripped away a certain kind of noise. The anxious static that usually occupied the back of his mind. Without it, what was left was cleaner, more like actual thinking. His parents had been magic. He knew that. Mrs. Figg had let that slip once, 2 years ago, in a way she'd immediately tried to walk back, and Harry had filed it away and never mentioned it because he'd learned very young that information you didn't acknowledge was information you got to keep. His parents had been magic, and they had died when he was 1, and he'd been brought to the Dursleys and told nothing, and Aunt Petunia called it that world in the same tone she used for raw sewage and estate agents. His parents had been magic, and they had had a name. Potter. He looked at the gold ring. The letters overlapping in the engraving, the clear P, and something older beneath it. Potter. He looked at the silver ring with its crest, the chevron, the dog or wolf, the style that felt centuries old. He didn't know that crest. But he knew, with the same certainty he'd felt when the ring slid onto his finger, that he should. And the stone ring. The symbol. The triangle, the circle, the line. Harry lay back on the camp bed with his hands folded on his chest and stared up at the bottom of the staircase 3 inches above his face, and thought carefully about what he knew and what he needed to know and what he intended to do about the difference. The rings, he decided, knew who he was. The question was whether they'd been waiting for him specifically, or just waiting for whoever came along. The way the gold one had felt, the recognition, suggested the former. If they'd been waiting for him specifically, then someone had put them there. Which meant someone knew enough about him to know he'd end up hiding behind a dead tree in Mrs. Figg's garden. Mrs. Figg. Harry thought about that for a while. He fell asleep still thinking about it, which was unusual, because his sleep was normally shallow and alert, the sleep of someone who'd learned to wake up quickly. Tonight it was deep and dreamless, and when he woke up the next morning he felt, for the first time in his memory, genuinely rested. The letter arrived 3 days later. Not by owl, that would have required an owl, and whatever protective enchantments existed around Privet Drive had kept owls away from the house for as long as Harry could remember. This letter arrived by a method he couldn't immediately identify. It was simply there, on the floor of the cupboard under the stairs, when he woke up. Crisp cream parchment, sealed with wax the color of old blood, stamped with a device that showed a shield quartered by goblin script. He opened it. To Harry James Potter, Lord of the ancient and noble houses of Potter, Black, Peverell, and Ravenclaw, and heir to the title of High King of Magical Britain, your immediate attendance is requested at Gringotts Wizarding Bank, Diagon Alley, London, at your earliest convenience. The matter is one of considerable legal and financial importance and has been pending for 7 years, 3 months, and 14 days. Director Ragnarok extends his personal assurance of safe passage and absolute confidentiality. Account Manager, Sharpclaw Gringotts Wizarding Bank. Harry read it twice. Then he read it a third time, more slowly, with particular attention to the address. Lord of the ancient and noble houses of Potter, Black, Peverell, and Ravenclaw. 4 houses. 4 rings. Heir to the title of High King of Magical Britain. He thought about that phrase for a long time, sitting cross-legged on the camp bed with the letter in his hands. It should have felt absurd. A boy who slept in a cupboard, wore his cousin's old clothes, and had spent most of his 8 years being told he was worthless, abnormal, and a burden, that boy being addressed as a lord and an heir to a title didn't connect to anything in his self-concept. Except the ring sat on his fingers like they'd always been there, and the recognition he'd felt in the root cellar hadn't faded, and he was very tired of being told what he was by people who were wrong about him. Heir to the title of High King of Magical Britain. Harry Potter folded the letter carefully and tucked it under the thin mattress of his camp bed, and began to think about how to get to London. It turned out that getting to London without Vernon and Petunia's knowledge was more straightforward than he'd expected, because the rings had done something to his capacity for planning that was hard to describe precisely. It was like having access to a very good map when you'd previously been navigating by feel. The route was the same, but the picture of it was sharper. Dudley's gang met on Tuesday and Thursday mornings, which meant Dudley was out of the house and Vernon and Petunia were effectively alone with their relief at not having to manage Dudley and Harry simultaneously. On those mornings, Petunia typically spent an hour on the phone with her neighbor, and Vernon read the paper in the garden. Neither of them checked on Harry between breakfast and lunch. Tuesday morning, Harry put on the least terrible of Dudley's hand-me-down clothes, took the emergency £5 note he'd been keeping in the lining of his one pair of trainers for 2 years, and walked to the bus stop on Magnolia Road. He took the bus to Reading. From Reading he took a train to Paddington. From Paddington he took the tube to Charing Cross, because the letter had included, in small writing at the bottom, a note that read, "The entrance to Diagon Alley can be located through the Leaky Cauldron Public House, Charing Cross Road. Ask for Tom." He walked out of Charing Cross Station into the thick summer heat of London and looked at the street with its bookshops and traffic and tourists and thought, somewhere in this city is a hidden world, and one of its oldest institutions has been waiting 7 years to talk to me. The Leaky Cauldron was between a music shop and a bookshop on Charing Cross Road, and it was genuinely difficult to see, not invisible exactly, but Harry had the impression that his eyes wanted to slide past it, that something in the visual field around the building was mildly, professionally discouraging attention. The rings pushed back against that. When he focused, the building snapped into clarity, dark brick, a swinging sign with a cauldron painted on it, a door that looked like it hadn't been painted since the war. Harry pushed it open and went inside. The inside of the Leaky Cauldron was dim and smoky and smelled of wood ash and something herbal and sweet that he didn't have a word for yet. A handful of people sat at tables with drinks in front of them, old, mostly, wearing robes in various states of repair, and behind the bar, a bald man with no teeth was polishing a glass with a rag that appeared to be making the glass dirtier rather than cleaner. The bar went quiet when Harry walked in. Not dramatically quiet, not every head turning, glass-dropping silence. Just the particular quiet of people who've noticed something but are trying not to be obvious about noticing it. Harry walked to the bar. "Tom," he said. The bald man looked at him. His eyes went to Harry's forehead, to the scar that Harry's fringe usually covered, except today his fringe had been pushed aside by the walk in the summer heat, and his expression went through something rapid and complicated. "Bless my soul," Tom said quietly. "You're Harry Potter." "I know," Harry said, because he did, and because he was increasingly impatient with other people's surprise at that fact. "I need to get to Gringotts. I have an appointment." Tom blinked. Whatever he'd expected, tears, confusion, a small child in need of reassurance, this apparently wasn't it. He led Harry through the pub to a small walled courtyard in the back, took out a wand, and tapped a specific sequence of bricks in the back wall. The bricks moved. Harry watched the wall peel back and open up into a cobblestone street that stretched away into a morning bustle of robed people and brightly painted shop fronts and things that shouldn't have been possible in London on a Tuesday in June, and felt something in his chest that he'd never felt before and didn't have a name for yet. It felt like coming in from the cold. Gringotts is straight up and at the end, Tom said, pointing at the white building that dominated the end of the street. You can't miss it. Mr. Potter, sir, it's wonderful to see you. Truly. Harry thanked him, because his parents had presumably raised him to have manners and he was trying to figure out what that looked like, and he walked into Diagon Alley for the first time. He didn't dawdle, though there was a very real argument for dawdling. Every shop front was a question. Every glimpse through a window, cauldrons stacked in towers, owls sitting on perches, a spinning display of wands in velvet, was something he wanted to investigate. He filed it all away and kept walking, because Gringotts first, everything else after. The bank was enormous and white and had an aggressive quality of solidity, like a building that had decided to be permanent and hadn't entertained alternatives. The words engraved above the door were familiar enough that he slowed to read them, a warning about greed and those who sought goblin gold, and he noted them and went inside. The interior was vast and busy and staffed entirely by goblins, which he'd known in the abstract way that you can know things from overheard comments and eavesdropped conversations, but which was still different in person. They were shorter than him, which surprised him because they seemed so much larger in presence, the way certain teachers seemed taller than they were because of how they held themselves. Each one behind the high counters was conducting business with an air of absolute authority, and the general feeling of the place was that you were in an institution that had been handling important things since before your country existed and had opinions about amateurs. Harry approached the nearest counter. The goblin looked at him. His eyes went to Harry's hands immediately, specifically to the rings. Something changed in the goblin's posture. Not deference exactly, because goblins didn't do deference, but a sharpening of attention, an upgrade in the quality of engagement, visible and deliberate. Harry Potter, the goblin said, and it wasn't a question. I have an appointment with Director Ragnarok, Harry said. Account Manager Sharpclaw sent a letter. The goblin looked at him for a moment longer than a purely transactional pause required. Then he came out from behind the counter in a way that clearly didn't happen routinely, and said, "Follow me, please." The rooms behind the main hall were progressively less ornate and progressively more serious. They walked through corridors of stone that went downward at a subtle angle, past doors that had no handles, past other goblins who stopped and looked when Harry passed and said nothing. The goblin who was leading him, who had never introduced himself, moved at a brisk pace that Harry matched without difficulty. They stopped in front of a door that was different from the others, plain wood, unremarkable, with a small brass plate that read Director. Director Ragnarok is expecting you, the goblin said, and opened the door. Ragnarok was old. That was the first thing Harry noticed. Not old in the way of people who'd aged badly, but old in the way of mountains, with a quality of deep time that made the word bold seem inadequate. He was seated behind a desk covered in scrolls and ledgers, and he was looking at Harry with eyes that were small and dark and contained something that took Harry a moment to identify. Respect. Actual respect. Not the complicated, uncomfortable, what do we do with the boy who lived deference that Tom had shown in the pub. Something cleaner. Something earned. Sit down, Harry Potter, Ragnarok said. Harry sat. You found the rings, Ragnarok said. They were waiting for me, Harry said. In a root cellar under a dead tree in my neighbor's garden. Were they supposed to be there? Something moved in Ragnarok's face. No. They were supposed to be in your family vault. Someone moved them. He paused. They could not have been moved there by accident. Someone placed them where you would find them at the appropriate time. Appropriate time meaning now. The rings recognize maturity of magical intent, not chronological age, Ragnarok said. In rare cases, the trigger event occurs early. You are, by some years, the youngest claimant recorded. He did not say this with any suggestion that Harry should be impressed by it. He said it the way you report a fact. What do you know of your inheritance? Almost nothing, Harry said. I wasn't told anything. About this world, about my family, about any of it. Ragnarok looked at him steadily. What were you told? That my parents died in a car crash. That magic doesn't exist. That I shouldn't ask questions. A pause that had weight to it. There are 4 estates currently held in trust under your name, Ragnarok said. Potter Manor in Godric's Hollow, damaged but standing. The Black properties, which include 12 Grimmauld Place in London, the Black family estate in Scotland, and 7 other properties in Britain and abroad. The Peverell holdings, which are extensive and complex, including properties in 3 countries. And the Ravenclaw estate in the Scottish Highlands, which has been sealed since the death of Helena Ravenclaw's last surviving descendant. He paused. Prior to you. Harry absorbed this without expression. Something that might have been the stone ring's influence, a certain steadiness when confronted with scale. There is also the matter of the Potter Vault's current contents, Ragnarok said, which, I am obliged to inform you, are significantly less than they should be. Someone's been taking money. Someone has been making quarterly withdrawals for purposes described as guardianship expenses and educational provision since shortly after your parents died. Ragnarok's voice was very flat. The withdrawals were authorized by a key held by your magical guardian. Dumbledore, Harry said. Ragnarok said nothing, which was an answer. Harry looked at the desk and thought about that. He thought about Vernon's complaints about the expense of feeding and housing him, the theatrical size, the carefully cultivated guilt, the narrative that Harry's presence was a financial drain. He thought about this carefully and from several angles, the way the bronze ring seemed to encourage, and what he arrived at was not rage, not yet, but something colder and more useful. How much is left? He asked. Considerably less than 40% of the original sum, Ragnarok said. The Potter Vault was one of the larger holdings in this institution. And no one at Gringotts stopped it. The withdrawals were authorized. Gringotts does not investigate authorized transactions. A pause. We do, however, record them with great accuracy. Every withdrawal. Every amount. Every date. He placed a sealed scroll on the desk between them. Should you wish to pursue the matter legally. Harry took the scroll. I'll need a solicitor. A wizarding one. Someone who isn't connected to Dumbledore. There is a firm, Ragnarok said, by the name of Blackwell and Rake, operating out of Horizon Alley. They have represented Goblin interests before the Wizengamot on 3 occasions. They are expensive and entirely independent. Can you contact them for me? We already have, Ragnarok said, and for the first time something moved in his face that might, in a different species, have been called a smile. We have been waiting for you for some time, Lord Potter. We prefer to be prepared. Harry looked at the scroll on the desk, then at the rings on his hands, then at the goblin director across from him. Lord Potter, he said, trying the phrase experimentally. It didn't feel wrong. That was more unsettling than if it had felt absurd. The Black Ring, do you know anything about the Black family? There's a crest. A chevron and what looks like a dog. A dog, Ragnarok said, with the particular tone of someone correcting a small but significant error. The black crest is a chevron and a wolf. Though the family tendency has historically been toward a different canine transformation. He paused. You are not aware of any living Black family members? I don't know anything about my family, Harry said, with a patience that was doing real work. Ragnarok folded his hands on the desk. There is one. A Sirius Black, first in the line of inheritance, currently imprisoned in Azkaban. He has been there since shortly after your parents died. He paused again. Without a trial. Silence. Without a trial, Harry repeated. It is not, by strict reading of the law, legal, Ragnarok said. However, Azkaban is administered by the Ministry, and the ministry chooses what it investigates and what it does not. Harry looked at the rings again. The silver one. The cool, moon-pale metal. Is he listed as Lord Black? He asked. He is listed as a prisoner. However, the title is unoccupied. The ring being on your finger rather than his suggests the ancestral magic considers you the primary heir. Ragnar's voice was careful. If a Lord of House Black were to formally petition the Wizengamot for a review of an imprisoned House member's case, it would be hard to ignore, Harry said. Very difficult indeed. Harry sat with that for a moment. Then he said, I'll need to understand how the Wizengamot works. Who sits on it, how votes are structured, what a lord of 4 ancient houses can actually do. Ragnar regarded him across the desk for a long moment. You are 8 years old, he said. Not unkindly. More in the manner of noting something extraordinary. I know, Harry said. Does that change any of what we've discussed? No, Ragnar said, with a finality that seemed to settle something. No, it does not. He reached beneath the desk and produced another scroll, this one thick and dense with text. This is a summary of Wizengamot structure, voting rights by house seniority, and the legal mechanisms available to ancient and noble house lords. I had it prepared when the account flag triggered on the day you found the rings. He set it on the desk beside the first scroll. There is one other matter. Harry waited. Your magical guardian arrangement, Ragnar said, is a legal instrument that can be challenged. However, it requires you to appear before a Wizengamot subcommittee in person and formally invoke your lordship status. Once you have done so, the guardianship transfers to your designated house representative, or to the Wizengamot itself in trust, until such time as you reach majority. He paused. The process is not without opposition. There are those with vested interests in the current arrangement. Dumbledore, Harry said again. And others, Ragnar said. The wizarding world has a political architecture that depends, to a degree, on your remaining ignorant of your position. His voice didn't change. I say this not to alarm you, but because you asked me to be direct, and I am a goblin. We are direct. I appreciate that, Harry said, and meant it. He picked up both scrolls. I'll need to come back. There's a lot I don't know yet. You may use this office whenever required, Ragnar said. The director's office is at your disposal, Lord Potter. He rose, a formal gesture, Harry understood, not a routine one. Gringotts has served your family for generations. We have a professional interest in your success. And a personal one? Harry asked, because the bronze ring made him notice things. Ragnar looked at him. That almost smile again, sharper this time. The High King title carries with it treaty obligations between the throne and Gringotts that predate the ministry by 4 centuries. Treaties which the ministry has spent 4 centuries politely ignoring. He inclined his head. We are interested parties, yes. Harry stood and offered his hand, because it seemed right, and because the rings hummed with something approving when he did. Ragnar shook it. His grip was strong and his eyes were sharp, and Harry had the distinct impression that he'd just made the most important alliance of his life in a room that probably saw 20 important alliances a year. I'll be back, Harry said. We know, said Ragnar. He walked back through Diagon Alley with the 2 scrolls tucked under his arm and a different quality of attention, looking at things differently now, seeing the political geography of the street in a way he hadn't been able to before. The apothecary with its dusty window. The robe shop. The owl emporium. The bookshop, flourish and blots, its window crammed with texts that he needed in a way that felt almost physical. He went into Flourish and Blots and spent 40 minutes and £4 of his £5 note on 3 books, a basic history of Wizarding Britain, a text on magical inheritance law, and a primer on Wizengamot procedure. The bookseller wrapped them in brown paper without comment. Harry walked back toward the leaky cauldron, feeling the weight of them under his arm and thinking about all the things that had happened in the last 3 days and all the things that were going to happen next. He stepped through the leaky cauldron and out onto Charing Cross Road, and the Muggle world closed around him like water over a stone, loud and normal and entirely unaware of what had just happened 20 feet away, behind an unremarkable door. He caught the tube back to Paddington. On the train back to Reading, he opened the scroll about Wizengamot structure and started reading. The conductor who walked through the carriage at Slough noticed a small boy with dark hair and green eyes and round glasses sitting with a very large piece of parchment on his knees, reading with the focused intensity of someone who'd found exactly what they were looking for. He'd wondered, briefly, where the boy's parents were. The rings on the boy's hands caught the train window light and flashed briefly, gold and silver and stone grey and bronze, and the conductor forgot what he'd been looking at and moved on down the carriage. Harry read all the way back to Little Whinging. He went to bed that night with his head full of names and procedures and voting blocks and inheritance chains, and he lay in the dark of the cupboard with his hands on his chest and looked at nothing and thought about a man called Sirius Black who had been in prison for 7 years without a trial, and about a vault that had been quietly drained while he slept in a cupboard, and about a world that had built an entire political structure around the assumption that Harry Potter would never know what he was. The gold ring was warm against his finger. The silver ring was steady. The stone ring was quiet, in the way of deep things. The bronze ring turned the facts he'd gathered into patterns, and the patterns into plans. Harry Potter closed his eyes, and for the first time in his life, he felt something that he'd eventually learn to call purpose. He had quite a lot of work to do. Chapter 2, The Account of House Potter. The books took him 2 weeks. Not because they were difficult, the Wizengamot primer was dry as chalk but logically structured, and the inheritance law text was dense in the way of things written by people who loved precision, but because he had to read them in stolen hours. 20 minutes before Petunia woke up. An hour during Dudley's Saturday football. The long Tuesday and Thursday windows when Dudley was out and Vernon was in the garden and nobody checked on the boy in the cupboard. He kept the books behind a loose brick at the back of the cupboard, beside the Gringotts scrolls and a folded piece of paper where he'd started writing down names, connections, and questions. The piece of paper had become 3 pieces of paper by the end of the first week. He learned things. The Wizengamot had been the governing body of magical Britain for roughly 600 years, built on a foundation of ancient and noble houses whose votes were weighted by the age and standing of their lineage. Below that were the minor houses, then the appointed members, ministry officials, senior department heads, and then the general body of voting witches and wizards whose participation was largely ceremonial. Real power lived in the ancient and noble tier. There were 28 ancient and noble houses historically. Currently active, 19. Currently represented, 16, since 3 had no living lord and their proxy votes defaulted to a ministry-appointed regent. 4 of those 28 ancient and noble houses, Potter, Black, Peverell, and Ravenclaw, carried a combined voting weight that, by the constitutional texts of the original Wizengamot founding charter of 1289, superseded the majority of the remaining 24 when acting in concert. This was the legal basis, dusty and untouched for centuries, of the High King provision. If the 4 bloodlines ever converged, the charter allowed for the consolidated claim to be brought before the full body as a constitutional motion, which required a 2/3 majority to dismiss, and could not be dismissed at all if the rings confirmed the claim independently. The rings confirmed everything. Harry wrote that down, underlined it twice, and circled it. Then he wrote, "They will try to say I'm too young. Look up, age restrictions on lordship claims. Charter versus statute." He looked it up. The original charter had no age restriction. The statute of 1672 had introduced a minimum age of 17 for assuming full lordship powers. But, and this was the part that made the bronze ring hum quietly against his finger, the charter predated the statute by nearly 4 centuries, and constitutional law was clear that founding documents superseded subsequent statute unless the subsequent statute had been passed specifically to amend the founding document, which the 1672 statute had not. It had been a general amendment to minor house succession law that had never envisaged a scenario where a child might hold 4 rings simultaneously. Harry wrote, "Charter supersedes statute." Site 1289 Founding Charter, Clause 7, Section 3. Also, precedent. Look for historical cases of underage lordship. He found 2. Both obscure, both in footnotes, both decided in favor of the claimant. He added them to the notes. By the end of the 2 weeks, he had a clear picture and a plan with 4 distinct stages, and he'd been back to Gringotts twice, once to meet the solicitors Ragnarok had contacted, and once to review the specific withdrawal records from the Potter vault. The solicitors were a wizard named Aldrich Blackwell and a witch named Saren Rake, and they were exactly what Ragnarok had implied: expensive, sharp, and deeply uninterested in anything except the legal question in front of them. Blackwell was 60, built like a retired boxer, with close-cropped gray hair and the manner of a man who had stopped being impressed by titles and institutions sometime in the previous century. Rake was younger, mid-40s, Harry estimated, with quick eyes and a voice that cut through ambiguity like a letter opener through soft paper. They met in a small office off Horizon Alley that smelled of old leather and coffee and had a bookshelf covering one entire wall. Harry sat across from them and laid out his situation in the most organized way he could manage, using his notes as reference, and when he was done they looked at him for a moment in silence. "You're 8, Blackwell said. "Almost 9, Harry said. "Does that change the legal analysis?" Blackwell and Rake exchanged a look. "No," Rake said. "It changes the practical analysis somewhat. The Wisengamot is not required to take a minor's petition seriously, not required by statute, that is. However," she paused, tapping the edge of her desk. "A petition presented by a lord of 4 ancient houses, accompanied by the constitutional charter clause you've identified, is not technically a minor's petition. It's a constitutional motion. The procedural rules are entirely different." "They'll try to delay it," Blackwell said. "Refer it to subcommittee. Request verification of the rings." "Let them verify," Harry said. "The rings are real." Another look between them. "All right," Blackwell said, and pulled a fresh sheet of parchment toward him with the air of someone who'd decided to enjoy himself. "Let's build you a case." The second visit to Gringotts, for the vault records, was the one that made the gold ring burn. Not literally. But when Sharpclaw, his assigned account manager, a young-looking goblin with sharp cheekbones and ink-stained fingers, spread the withdrawal ledger across the table and started walking him through the entries, Harry felt something move through the warmth in the gold ring that was less like heat and more like grief translated into temperature. The withdrawals had started 11 days after his parents died. Small at first, reasonable, even, if you accepted the fiction that they were for a child's care. 50 galleons in November 1981. 100 in January 1982. Growing steadily through the next 3 years, branching into categories that made less and less sense: educational research, security consultancy, administrative provision. By 1985 the quarterly withdrawals had reached 300 galleons, and there was a separate line item, appearing twice yearly, described only as miscellaneous guardian expenses that had been running at 200 galleons since 1983. None of it had gone to Privet Drive. Harry was absolutely certain of that. He'd lived on Privet Drive for 8 years, and miscellaneous guardian expenses at 200 galleons twice yearly would have required the Dursleys to actually spend money on him, and the evidence of his wardrobe alone demolished that theory. "Where did it go?" Harry asked. "We don't track the destination of withdrawals," Sharpclaw said carefully. "Only the authorization and the amount." However, he slid a separate sheet across. "The key used for authorization is registered to Albus Percival Wulfric Brian Dumbledore. He has accessed this account on 19 separate occasions." Harry looked at the sheet. 19 times. Over 7 years. He thought about Dumbledore, the man he'd never met, the man who apparently ran the school that his parents had attended, the man who seemed to exist at the center of every decision that had been made about Harry's life without Harry's knowledge. He thought about Tom's face in the leaky cauldron when he'd said "It's wonderful to see you," truly, the weight in it, the specific texture of relief that implied a long absence. He thought about the world he'd seen in Diagon Alley, the people who'd recognized his scar and gone quiet, the sense of something unresolved that hung over the whole place like weather. He took the sheet and folded it into his notes. "I want a full accounting," he said. "Every withdrawal, every authorization, every date. On parchment with the Gringotts seal. My solicitors will need certified copies." "Already prepared," Sharpclaw said, and produced a scroll that was considerably thicker than Harry had expected. Harry picked it up. Felt the weight of it. Set it down again. "Thank you," he said. Then, because he'd been thinking about how to ask this for 2 weeks, Sharpclaw, the Peverell ring. "What do you know about it?" Sharpclaw was quiet for a moment. "The Peverell line is the oldest recorded magical bloodline in Britain," he said. "The ring predates Gringotts by several centuries. Our records on the Peverell estate are extensive, but the ring itself," he paused. "We know what it signifies. The 3 Hallows. The Deathly Hallows. You are presumably aware, I've read about them," Harry said. "In the history book. They're listed as legend. Most things listed as legend are listed that way by people who would prefer they remain legend," Sharpclaw said, with a dryness that felt very goblin. "The ring is the resurrection stone, remade into a band by the Peverell line's 3rd generation. It has passed through the family in various forms." He paused again. "Its current configuration suggests it has been stabilized. Whatever made it dangerous in previous incarnations appears to have been resolved." Harry looked at the ring on his left hand. The dark stone face. The triangle and circle and line. "Resolved how?" he asked. "We don't know," Sharpclaw said. "We know only that when it passed to you, certain flagged enchantments on Gringotts' monitoring system stopped registering." He met Harry's eyes. "It stopped resonating with death magic when you put it on." Harry absorbed that. "And started resonating with something else?" Sharpclaw's expression did something complicated. "Something older," he said. "We don't have a precise classification." Harry decided to table that for later. There were more immediate problems. He was walking back through Diagon Alley toward the leaky cauldron, his bag of scrolls and notes heavier than it looked, when someone said his name. Not in the cautious, reverent way Tom had said it. In the sharp, surprised way of someone who genuinely didn't expect to see him. He turned. The woman standing outside Madame Malkin's was tall, with silver-streaked black hair worn in a severe bun, square spectacles, and robes that were so precisely pressed they looked load-bearing. She was perhaps 60, perhaps 70, age sat differently on wizards, Harry had already noticed, and she was looking at him with an expression that was cycling rapidly through surprise, concern, assessment, and something sharper than all 3. She had a Hogwarts badge on her robes. Deputy Headmistress, it read. "Harry Potter," she said, and crossed the distance between them in 4 quick strides. She crouched slightly to bring herself closer to his eye level, which he appreciated, because most adults who wanted to look at him loomed. "I'm Minerva McGonagall. I taught your parents." "I know who you are," Harry said. She blinked. "You do. You're in the history book. You testified at the inquest after my parents died. You were one of the witnesses who saw the destruction at Godric's Hollow the morning after." He watched her face. "You also wrote an objection to Dumbledore's decision to place me with the Dursleys, which was recorded in the Wisengamot minutes and then apparently ignored." The expression on McGonagall's face went through something Harry couldn't entirely read. "You've been doing research," she said. "Yes. Where are you living? Are you all right? You look," she stopped. Looked at him properly. Not at the scar, which was what most people looked at. At him, the too large clothes, the slight undefeatedness, the quality of watchfulness that he wore like a second skin. Her jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "You look like you've been managing on your own." "I have been," Harry said. "I'm fine." He paused, because the bronze ring was doing the thing it did when it identified something useful, and McGonagall had objected to his placement and she was here and she'd taught his parents. Do you have time to talk? There are things I'd like to ask someone who's not a solicitor or a banker. McGonagall looked at him for a moment with an expression that he'd eventually learn was her dealing with being surprised and choosing not to show it. Then she said, "There's a tea shop on the other side of the alley. They do a perfectly acceptable pot of Darjeeling." Harry shifted his bag on his shoulder. "Lead the way." The tea shop was small and relatively quiet at this hour, with round tables and mismatched chairs and a general atmosphere of comfortable age. McGonagall ordered tea and a plate of shortbread and sat across from Harry with the straight-backed stillness of someone who had spent decades keeping rooms in order through sheer posture. "You found the rings," she said, looking at his hands. "You know about them," Harry said. "I know about the Potter ring and what it means." "The others," she paused. "Lord of 4 ancient houses. I didn't think I'd see it in my lifetime." Something crossed her face. "Your father would have been insufferably pleased." Harry felt something move in his chest at that. Small and sharp. "Tell me about him," he said. "Not a question." McGonagall looked at him over her teacup. Then she set it down and said, "James Potter was clever, infuriating, loyal to a degree that occasionally overrode his good judgment, and deeply happy, which I think is the thing most people forget about him when they describe him. He was happy. He loved your mother so completely it was almost embarrassing to observe." She paused. "You have his hair, obviously. You have her eyes. Her stubbornness, too, I suspect, though you hide it more efficiently than she did." "What about the Black family?" Harry asked. "Sirius Black, my father's friend?" Something complicated moved through McGonagall's expression. "Sirius is in Azkaban," she said carefully. "Without a trial," Harry said. Silence. "You know about that," she said. "I know Gringotts' version," Harry said. "I'd like yours." McGonagall was quiet for a long moment. She turned her teacup in its saucer, a small, restless gesture. "I will tell you what I believe, and what I believe is not what the official record states." She looked up at him. "Sirius Black was your father's best friend. Your godfather. He was listed as your magical guardian in your parents' will, which was never read, and he was in Azkaban within 48 hours of your parents' death on charges that were never formally presented before any court." She paused. "I do not believe he betrayed them. I never believed it. But the war had just ended, the Ministry was in chaos, and Dumbledore," another pause, longer. "Dumbledore chose to trust the chaos's conclusions rather than investigate them." "Dumbledore made a mistake," Harry said. "Not a question." McGonagall looked at him with those sharp eyes. "Dumbledore makes fewer mistakes than most and carries the ones he makes worse than almost anyone," she said. "That doesn't make the mistakes smaller." She folded her hands on the table. "What are you planning, Harry?" He looked at her for a moment. "Decided. I'm planning to formally claim my lordship before the Wizengamot and challenge the guardianship arrangement. I'm planning to get Sirius Black a trial. I'm planning to find out where the money from the Potter vault went and pursue legal restitution." He paused. "And eventually I'm planning to formally claim the High King title. But that last one can wait until I understand the landscape better." McGonagall stared at him. "You're 8 years old," she said. "People keep saying that," Harry said. "It hasn't been an argument so far." Something moved in McGonagall's face then, something she clearly had to work to suppress, and which lived in the territory between admiration and laughter. She pressed her lips together. "You'll need someone in the wizarding world. An adult. Someone the Wizengamot will recognize as a responsible. Will they recognize you?" Harry asked. The question landed in the quiet of the tea shop and sat there. "I'm the deputy headmistress of Hogwarts," McGonagall said carefully. "I have standing before the Wizengamot in several capacities. You already objected to my placement once, Harry said. You've been overruled. If I come to you with a constitutional motion and legal representation and a formal lordship claim, you're no longer asking them as a private citizen, you're appearing as a representative of the Lord of 4 ancient houses. McGonagall was very still. That's quite a different thing, she said quietly. It is, Harry agreed. She looked at him for a long time. Out the window of the tea shop, Diagon Alley went about its business, witches and wizards moving up and down the cobblestones, broomsticks in a shop front, the smell of potion ingredients from the apothecary 2 doors down. I wrote to Dumbledore 7 times in the first year, McGonagall said suddenly. About the Dursleys. About you. About the will not being read. He responded to all 7 letters. In none of them did he tell me that Sirius hadn't been given a trial. She said this quietly, without anger, in the tone of someone reporting a fact they've made their peace with and then made their peace with again. I found that out from a ministry contact 3 years ago. Does Dumbledore know you know? Harry asked. We haven't discussed it. Harry thought about that. The bronze ring turned it around several times. He'll be at the Wisengamot hearing, he said. He won't oppose it openly. Opposing a constitutional motion brought by a legitimate lord of 4 ancient houses would be politically catastrophic. But he'll try to manage it. Steer the outcome. He'll be concerned about me and he'll express that concern in ways that are designed to look like everyone's interests aligning. He paused. I'd like you to be there so that someone in the room knows what his managing looks like. McGonagall's eyes were steady and sharp. How do you know what his managing looks like? You've never met him. No, Harry said. But you have. And you just described it to me without using the word. A pause. You're 9 in 2 weeks, she said, and there was something in her voice that was not quite sorrow and not quite wonder. Yes, Harry said. Your father was 21 before he learned to argue like that, she said. Your mother was 16. Harry almost smiled. It was close, the closest he'd come to it in the alley today. I'll take that as a compliment. It is one, McGonagall said. She looked at the rings on his hands again, then back at his face, and something settled in her expression, a decision made, a thing committed to. Tell me what you need me to do. Harry reached into his bag and produced his notes. They were there for 2 hours. McGonagall turned out to be extraordinarily useful in the way of people who'd spent 30 years navigating an institution and had a precise mental map of where all its load-bearing walls were. She identified 3 Wisengamot members who would support a constitutional motion on principle, Lord Greengrass, Lady Longbottom, and a man named Ogden who'd been quietly opposed to the Ministry's post-war chaos for years. She identified 2 who would vote against purely out of self-interest, Malfoy, obviously, and a woman named Umbridge who held an appointed seat and whose politics McGonagall described with a brevity that suggested she had opinions she was choosing not to fully express. She explained the procedural mechanics of how to bring a motion to the floor, the specific language required for a constitutional invocation, and the fact that the Chief Warlock, currently Dumbledore, had discretionary power to schedule hearings but not to prevent them once formally filed. File it in writing, through the official registry, she said. Dumbledore can delay a verbal motion. He cannot delay a registered filing without publicly violating procedure. Blackwell and Rake are already drafting the filing, Harry said. McGonagall looked at the name. Blackwell and Rake. You hired them on your own. Ragnarok recommended them. Of course he did. She set the notes down. Harry. I have to ask you something directly. She met his eyes. Dumbledore placed you with the Dursleys because of a protection. Your mother's sacrifice, the love magic she invoked when she died for you, it anchors to the place where blood family lives. It keeps you safe from Voldemort's followers. She paused. It's real, and it's significant. That protection will end when you formally establish independent residence. Harry had already read about the blood protection. It was in the inheritance law text, referenced obliquely in a section on sacrifice-based enchantments. I know, he said. And you're not concerned? Voldemort's currently, he paused. Not fully present. Whatever happened in Godric's Hollow, he wasn't destroyed, but he's not in a form where a blood protection matters much. He looked at McGonagall evenly. And in the meantime, I'm living in a cupboard. The effect of the word cupboard on McGonagall was visible and swift and followed by a stillness that Harry recognized as someone managing a strong response with long practice. A cupboard, she said. Under the stairs, he said. She reached for her teacup. Her hand was entirely steady. Her voice, when she spoke, was also entirely steady, and Harry understood that both of these things were taking effort. I see. The Dursleys, Harry started. Don't, McGonagall said, quietly and firmly. Not yet. Tell me when we're done with the legal steps and then tell me about the Dursleys, because currently I want to go to Privet Drive and I don't think that serves your timeline. Harry nodded. He appreciated that she'd said your timeline. There's one more thing, he said. The hearing, when we appear before the Wizengamot. Dumbledore will be there. I'll be appearing as Lord of Four Houses and bringing a constitutional motion, and he'll be Chief Warlock, and he'll know exactly what I'm doing and why, and he'll have had time to prepare. He paused. I don't want him to have had too much time to prepare. What's the minimum notice period for a constitutional motion filing? McGonagall thought. 14 days. So if we file on a Thursday, the hearing can be the Thursday after next. In theory. Can you make sure Dumbledore doesn't learn about it until the filing date? Harry asked. Not through you, you just have to not mention it. But are there people who might tell him? People who know you've met with me today? McGonagall looked around the tea shop. A few people had looked at them during their 2 hours, at Harry specifically, but nobody had approached, and the conversations that had resumed around them had the quality of people who were trying not to appear to be listening. There are always people who might tell him, she said. Then we file tomorrow, Harry said. McGonagall looked at him for a moment, and this time she didn't suppress it. Something moved across her face that was, without question, a kind of fierce, surprised pride. She straightened her already straight back. I'll contact Blackwell first thing in the morning, she said. What time do they open? 8, Harry said. I'll be there at 8, she said, and it sounded like a promise and a declaration at once. The filing was submitted to the Wizengamot registry at 9:10 on the following morning, a Thursday, and by all accounts, the clerk who received it read the address on the outer parchment, read it again, and then walked very quietly into the back office and sat down. Harry wasn't there for the filing. Blackwell and Rake handled it, but Rake sent him a message through the method they'd established, a small enchanted paper bird that dissolved when he read it, with the words, filed and accepted. Registry has stamped the date. 14 days from today. They can't move it. Harry read it in the cupboard on Thursday evening, burned the paper bird over the drain in the kitchen sink while Petunia was in the sitting room, and went back to his notes. The next day, in the morning, the second letter arrived. This one was not on Gringotts parchment. It was on thick cream paper with a purple seal, and the handwriting was elegant and slightly rushed, the handwriting of someone who writes a great deal and has developed speed at the expense of nothing. Dear Harry, I am writing to you because I understand you have recently become more aware of your place in the wizarding world, and I wish to speak with you directly rather than allow our first meeting to be in a formal setting. I imagine you have questions, many of them, and reasonable ones. I also imagine that some of what you have learned has been difficult. I am deeply sorry for that, and I would like the opportunity to explain my choices to you in person. You may not be aware, but I have always had your well-being as my primary concern. Everything I did after that terrible night was done with you in mind. I would be grateful for the chance to say this to you myself. I would very much like to visit you, if that would be agreeable. Or, if you prefer a neutral location, I am entirely at your disposal. With great warmth and respect, Albus Dumbledore. Harry read this letter 3 times. He thought about the word choices. He thought about the word explain. He thought about your well-being as my primary concern in the context of 7 years of unauthorized withdrawals and a cupboard under the stairs and a godfather in Azkaban. He thought about what McGonagall had said, he'll try to manage it. Steer the outcome. Harry got out a piece of parchment. He'd bought parchment and ink in Diagon Alley, because Dudley's writing paper felt like the wrong material for this, and he wrote back. Dear Professor Dumbledore, thank you for your letter. I'm sure there is a great deal we will want to discuss. I prefer to wait until the Wizengamot hearing to speak in person, where the conversation can be formal and properly recorded. I believe that will serve both of us better than a private meeting at this stage. Regards, Harry Potter. He addressed it to Hogwarts, School of Witchcraft and Wizardry, and found that the enchanted post box outside the leaky cauldron, which he'd spotted and noted on his previous visit, accepted wizarding post and dispatched it by magic. He dropped the letter in and walked back to the tube station. The response came the following morning. Same purple seal, less elegant handwriting this time, more rushed, less controlled. Harry, I strongly advise against approaching the Wizengamot without first speaking to me. There are matters of great sensitivity involved, and I am concerned that without proper context, you may inadvertently cause harm, to yourself, to others who care about you, and to situations that are more delicate than they may appear. I am your guardian in magical matters, and I have responsibilities that I take very seriously. I ask you, please, to trust me. Albus Harry read this and found, to his own calm surprise, that he felt nothing except a kind of clean, analytical clarity. I strongly advise against was the language of someone who had advice to give. I am your guardian was the language of someone reminding him of a power arrangement. Trust me was the language of someone who understood that trust was not currently his to assume. He didn't write back. There was nothing to say that the hearing wouldn't say better. The 14 days moved at different speeds depending on the hour. During the days he was at Privet Drive, doing chores, staying out of Dudley's way, reading in stolen increments, they dragged. During the evenings, when he lay in the dark of the cupboard running through procedure and arguments and anticipated objections, they moved faster. He made 2 more trips to Horizon Alley to work through the case with Blackwell and Rake. He had a second meeting with McGonagall, in the same tea shop, where she walked him through the specific geography of the Wizengamot chamber and told him exactly where Dumbledore would be sitting and where Malfoy would be sitting and what Madame Bones's face looked like when she was genuinely uncertain versus when she was politically uncertain. Bones is the head of magical law enforcement, McGonagall told him. She's honest, genuinely, irritatingly, even. She doesn't like the Malfoys and she doesn't like it when the law is bent. But she'll be skeptical of a 9-year-old claiming lordship. Almost 9, Harry said. You'll have turned 9 by the hearing date, McGonagall said. Which is something, I suppose. What she'll need, Harry said, is the evidence from Gringotts. The withdrawal records. If she sees those, she has to act on them. She's the head of law enforcement, she can't see documented financial theft from a minor and do nothing. No, McGonagall agreed. She can't. She paused. Are you sure you want to bring those into the hearing? Once you put those records in front of the Wizengamot, there's no controlling what happens to them. Dumbledore will be there. I know, Harry said. That's rather the point. McGonagall looked at him steadily. You're not going to give him a private conversation where he can manage the narrative. You're going to present the evidence in public where he can't. He had 7 years to have a private conversation, Harry said. He chose not to. Another pause. Your mother would have done exactly this, she said. Exactly this, in exactly this sequence. She had no patience for being managed. She looked out the window of the tea shop. I suppose that's the Ravenclaw in you. Harry looked at the bronze ring. Tell me more about Rowena Ravenclaw, he said. I mean, the actual person. So McGonagall told him, over a second pot of Darjeeling, about the 4 founders and the thing they'd built together and the ways it had survived them and diverged from what they'd intended, and Harry listened to all of it and stored it, and thought about what it meant to inherit something that old and that complicated. By the time he walked back to the tube station that afternoon, he was ready. Not confident in the way of people who haven't thought about what could go wrong. Ready in the way of someone who has thought about everything that could go wrong and made a plan for each one. The hearing was in 4 days. He went home to the cupboard and polished his notes one final time. He thought about the 14 days and what he'd built in them: a legal case, 2 solicitors, 1 professor, a goblin director's confidence, and a constitutional argument that had been sitting and used in a charter since 1289, waiting for the specific combination of bloodlines that had apparently always been going to converge in the hands of a boy from Surrey. He thought about Sirius Black in Azkaban. 7 years. No trial. He thought about his parents, dead at 21, in a house that was still standing in Godric's Hollow. The gold ring was warm. The silver one was steady. The stone one was quiet. The bronze one was working. For days, Harry thought. Then it starts. Chapter 3, The Man in Azkaban. The Wizengamot chamber was older than anything Harry had been in before. He felt it when he walked through the door, not the door from the ministry atrium, which was polished and modern and smelled of floor wax, but the inner door, the one that opened onto the chamber itself. Beyond it was something that predated the ministry by centuries, and it knew it. The stone walls curved upward into vaulted shadows. The benches were tiered in a horseshoe around a central space, each one worn smooth by generations of robes and argument. The air had the quality of a room where significant things had been decided for a very long time, and some of them had been wrong. Harry walked in beside McGonagall, with Blackwell on his other side and Rake a half-step behind, carrying the document case. He walked in with his back straight and his hands at his sides, rings visible, and he didn't look at the floor once. The chamber was already full. Not packed, this was a special session, not a full sitting, but there were perhaps 60 people on the benches, more than Harry had expected for a procedural hearing. Word had traveled, clearly, in the 14 days since the filing. The faces that turned toward him as he came in ran the range from openly curious to carefully neutral to, in a few cases, something that lived in the neighborhood of hostility. He found Dumbledore immediately. Center of the curved bench at the top of the horseshoe, Chief Warlock's seat, wearing deep purple robes and an expression of careful benevolence that Harry suspected took years of practice. His eyes found Harry the moment Harry walked in, and there was something in them, a genuine warmth, complicated by something else, something that looked very like the expression of a chess player who has just realized the board is different from what he thought. Harry met his eyes briefly, acknowledged him with a small nod, and looked away. He found Malfoy next. Lower tier, third bench from the left, silver blonde hair and immaculate grey robes and a face that gave nothing away except the very slight tension at the jaw that suggested he was giving a great deal of effort to giving nothing away. Beside him, a younger woman in matching grey who Harry took to be his wife. Behind him, 2 men whose robes had the same quality of expensive neutrality. Harry catalogued all of this in the 12 steps it took to walk to the petitioner's table at the center of the horseshoe, and then he sat down and put his notes in front of him and waited. McGonagall took a seat in the public gallery, behind the bar. Her face was composed and her hands were folded, and she looked exactly like a professor who attended Wizengamot hearings regularly and had no strong feelings about the outcome. Harry almost smiled. Amelia Bones sat to Dumbledore's right, a square-jawed woman in her 50s with a monocle on a chain and the specific bearing of someone who had built their entire career on the principle that facts were facts regardless of who found them inconvenient. She was looking at the document Blackwell had placed in front of her with an expression that was already leaning towards something Harry recognized as genuine legal interest. Good. This special session, Dumbledore said, from the Chief Warlock's seat, with a voice that was warm and deep and carried authority the way weather carries pressure, is convened in response to a registered constitutional motion filed by, a brief pause, delicate as a held breath. Harry James Potter, claiming the lordship of 4 ancient and noble houses, by rights of blood and ancestral recognition. He looked down at Harry with an expression that managed to be simultaneously concerned and paternalistic and proud. Before we proceed, I would note, for the record, that Mr. Potter is 9 years of age, and that, Lord Potter, Blackwell said, with the flat, cheerful authority of a man who had been interrupted before and had developed opinions about it. A brief silence. "I beg your pardon," Dumbledore said. "The registered filing addresses my client as Lord Potter," Blackwell said pleasantly. "The title is claimed, not conferred, it's inherent in the bloodline and confirmed by the ancestral rings. Addressing him otherwise during formal proceedings would be," he appeared to consider his word choice, "irregular." Several people on the benches shifted. Malfoy's jaw tension increased by a measurable degree. Dumbledore looked at Blackwell for a moment, and then he smiled, and it was a real smile, which was what made it complicated. "Of course. I apologize." He looked down at Harry again. "Lord Potter." "Thank you," Harry said. He kept his voice level and clear. It carried in the stone chamber without effort. "If the chair is satisfied," Rake said, rising smoothly and opening the document case, "we'd like to proceed directly to the constitutional filing, since the standard preamble has been," she glanced at the benches, adequately covered by the session's advanced documentation. Bones looked up from her papers. "I have a question for the chair before we proceed." Dumbledore gestured for her to continue. "The 1289 Founding Charter, Clause 7, Section 3, Bones said, holding up the copy Rake had pre-filed. "I've read it this morning. It's quite clear. The constitutional claim of the High King's title, when supported by confirmation from all 4 ancestral rings, cannot be dismissed by simple majority, it requires 2/3 against, and the rings themselves must be presented and verified by the Chamber's Veritas Ward." She set the document down. "Has the Veritas Ward been prepared?" "It has not," said the court clerk, from his table beside the door. "Then I'd suggest we prepare it," Bones said, "before we go any further." She looked at Dumbledore with the polite implacability of a woman who had decided the law was the law. Dumbledore's expression didn't change. "Of course," he said again, and made a small gesture to the clerk. The Veritas Ward was a column of pale golden light that rose from the center of the chamber floor when the clerk activated it with a tap of his wand to a specific flagstone. It reached the vaulted ceiling and hung there, steady and clean, and the chamber felt different with it present, sharper, more serious, as though the air itself had made a commitment. "Lord Potter," Bones said, "would you be willing to present the rings for verification?" Harry stood and walked to the center of the chamber, into the column of light. The ward was warm. Not uncomfortable, but warm, the way sunlight through glass is warm. It had a quality of attention, of focus. He held out both hands, rings visible. The gold ring lit first. Not dramatically. A warm, reddish pulse that traveled from the ring up his finger and then seemed to settle into the light around him, becoming part of the ward's column. A murmur moved through the benches. The silver ring next. Cooler, steadier, its blue-gray metal throwing a light that was different from the gold, complementary, not competing. The stone ring was the one that made the chamber go quiet. The pulse of light from the dark stone face hit the ward column and something happened at the vaulted ceiling. The shadows up there moved, briefly, in a way that had nothing to do with the physical light sources in the room. A sound went through the benches that was not quite a gasp and not quite silence. The bronze ring last, its veins of deep blue brightening as the ward touched them, and then all 4 rings were resonating simultaneously, each frequency distinct, each one complementing the others, and the Veritas Ward went from a column of pale gold to something richer and more complex, light that seemed to contain harmonics, visible harmonics, strands of 4 different colors woven together. Harry stood in the center of it and felt the rings working in concert, the warmth of the gold, the clarity of the silver, the depth of the stone, the sharpness of the bronze, and it was like standing in a current. Not swept away. More like the feeling of finally swimming in the right direction. The ward faded. Harry walked back to his seat. The chamber was very quiet. "The Veritas Ward confirms all 4 ancestral rings," the clerk said, into the silence, with the particular neutrality of a man reading a weather report about a tornado. "Potter, Black, Peverell, and Ravenclaw." Authentication is, he checked his notes. Unprecedented. Right, said Bones, into the quiet, and she had the sound of a woman who had come in expecting a procedural oddity and found something else entirely. Then let's proceed. What followed was 2 hours of argument that Harry had prepared for and Blackwell and Rake had wargamed extensively, and which still had 3 moments that required real-time adjustment. The first was Malfoy. He spoke from the third bench with a voice that was smooth and unhurried and carried the deep confidence of a man who had spent 20 years being the most powerful person in most rooms he entered. He was not rude. He was not obvious. He raised procedural concerns about the age restriction statute of 1672, about the question of precedent, about the welfare implications of vesting a child with lordship powers, and he did all of this in the tone of a man who was deeply concerned for Harry's well-being and regretted the necessity of these objections. It was, Harry thought, a very good performance. Exactly as dangerous as anticipated. Blackwell handled the statutory argument, Charter versus Statute, the 1289 document's constitutional primacy, the 2 precedent cases Harry had found in the footnotes. He had a third precedent that Harry hadn't found, which turned out to be useful because Malfoy had clearly prepared for the 2 Harry knew about and the third caught him off guard by a fraction of a second, just enough to be visible to people watching for it. Harry handled the welfare argument himself. He stood up, waited for the murmur of surprise to settle, because apparently lords didn't typically address the chamber directly, they let their solicitors speak, and he said, clearly and without heat, I'd like to address the welfare point, with the chamber's permission. Dumbledore, in the chief warlock's seat, said, the chamber permits, in a voice that was very careful. Lord Malfoy suggests that vesting lordship powers in a 9-year-old raises welfare concerns, Harry said. I'd like to enter into the record the contents of my Gringotts account history, covering the period from November 1981 to the present date. He looked at Rake. Rake placed 3 copies of the certified Gringotts scroll on the chamber's evidence table. 1 for Bones. 1 for the clerk's record. 1 for the bench. This document shows 19 authorized withdrawals from the Potter family vault over 7 years, Harry said, totaling approximately 60% of the vault's holdings at the time of my parents' death, made under the authorization of the magical guardian arrangement currently in force. He paused. None of this money was spent on my behalf. I have spent the past 8 years living in a cupboard under a staircase in a house in Surrey. Another pause. With the chamber's indulgence, I would suggest that the welfare argument cuts rather in my favor. The silence that followed this was a specific kind of silence. Not stunned, not theatrical. The particular silence of a room in which several people are processing information that they are professionally required to respond to. Bones had the Gringotts scroll open in her hands. Her expression was doing several things simultaneously. She was a woman of genuine integrity navigating evidence that had implications she hadn't walked in here prepared to handle, and Harry watched her do it, watched her make the choice, cleanly and without hesitation, to handle it anyway. The authorization key on these withdrawals, Bones said, without looking up from the scroll, is registered to, Madam Bones, Dumbledore said, from the chief warlock's seat. His voice was still warm, but there was something under the warmth now, a kind of contained urgency. Perhaps this is a matter better handled by a dedicated investigation rather than, with respect, Chief Warlock, Bones said, and looked up, if these documents are authentic, and they carry the Gringotts seal, which this chamber accepts as authenticated, then we are looking at documented financial misappropriation from a minor's estate. That is a law enforcement matter regardless of the context in which it surfaces. Her voice was not unkind, but it was absolutely immovable. I'll be opening a file today. Malfoy, on the third bench, had gone very still. He'd come in planning to obstruct a constitutional motion. He had not, Harry suspected, come in planning to sit in a room where Gringotts evidence was entered into the formal record in front of the head of law enforcement. His eyes moved to Harry, just once, briefly, and what was in them wasn't anger. It was the cool, calculating appraisal of a man recalibrating. Of a man who has recognized that the board is different than he thought. Harry kept his face neutral. The constitutional motion passed 2 hours later, 47 to 11. The 11 were either Malfoy's proxies or people who decided that principle required them to vote against a 9-year-old claiming a medieval title regardless of the evidence. The remaining chamber members abstained or voted in favor, and Amelia Bones voted in favor with the expression of a woman who had decided that the law was the law and she'd deal with the consequences of that later. The formal result was recorded in the clerk's ledger: Harry James Potter recognized as Lord of the ancient and noble houses of Potter, Black, Peverell, and Ravenclaw, by constitutional provision and ancestral confirmation. Guardianship arrangement transferred to Wisengamot Trust pending further investigation. The High King claim was noted as pending, technically a separate motion, requiring a full sitting rather than a special session. Harry had expected that. He'd planned for it. What he hadn't planned for was Dumbledore meeting him at the chamber door as he was leaving. He was taller in person than Harry had imagined. Taller, and older, and there was something in his face, behind the beard, behind the half-moon glasses, behind the careful warmth, that looked like a man who had been carrying something very heavy for a very long time and had gotten good at not showing it. "Harry," he said, quietly, as the other members filed past them. "Professor Dumbledore," Harry said. They looked at each other. McGonagall was 2 steps behind Harry. Blackwell was 3. Nobody was in touching distance of Dumbledore, and Harry was aware of that as a deliberate thing without being able to say exactly who had arranged it. "I owe you a great deal of explanation," Dumbledore said. "I know that. I'm not asking you to accept it immediately, or to forgive anything. I simply want you to know that there was nothing I did that I didn't believe was right." A pause. "I was wrong about some of it. The money," his voice tightened almost imperceptibly. "I authorized those withdrawals for what I believed were legitimate purposes. Protective purposes. Knowing what you've been living in," he stopped. Something moved through his expression that was, Harry was fairly certain, genuine pain. "I didn't check. I should have checked." Harry looked at him for a long moment. "You'll have the chance to explain everything properly," Harry said. "When the investigation opens. Under oath." He kept his voice entirely even. "I'm not interested in punishing you, Professor. I'm interested in accuracy." Dumbledore looked at him for a moment with those very blue eyes. "You are very like your mother," he said, quietly. "So I'm told," Harry said. He walked past him, through the door, and up into the ministry atrium, and didn't look back. The investigation file was the first thing. The second thing, the thing Harry had been building toward since the moment he'd seen the silver ring in the root cellar, was Sirius Black. He raised it with Bones directly, 2 days after the hearing, in her office on the 3rd floor of the ministry. Her office was practical and slightly chaotic, stacked with files and case documents, with a battered wooden desk that had been used hard and a window that looked out onto an internal ministry courtyard. She was behind the desk when he arrived, and she looked at him over her monocle with the expression of a woman who had decided to treat him exactly as she would treat any other lord with standing before her office and was finding it required conscious effort. "Lord Potter," she said. "Madam Bones," Harry said, and took the offered chair. "Thank you for seeing me. I opened a file on the vault withdrawals yesterday," she said. "It'll take time. These things always do." "I'm not here about that today," Harry said. "I'm here about Sirius Black." Bones was very still for a moment. "Sirius Black is a convicted, he was never convicted," Harry said. "He was never tried. The Wisengamot records for November and December 1981 show no trial date, no formal charges, no conviction hearing. He was taken directly to Azkaban by Bartemius Crouch Sr. under emergency wartime provisions that expired 30 days after the fall of Voldemort." Harry put a copy of the relevant Wisengamot archive pages on her desk. Gringotts had pulled them from their own records, which cross-referenced court proceedings for estate management purposes. "He has been there for 7 years, 3 months, and 12 days. Without a trial." Bones didn't touch the documents. She was looking at Harry with an expression that was doing something complicated. "You're aware," she said carefully, "of what Black is alleged to have done." "I'm aware of what he was alleged to have done by people who never put it to a court," Harry said. "Which is a different thing." Silence. "He is the man accused of betraying your parents," Bones said, and it was gentle, the way a warning is sometimes gentle. "He is the man my father trusted above everyone else," Harry said. "He is the man my parents listed as my guardian in their will. He is the man the silver ring identifies as the lord of the noble house of Black." Harry held up his right hand. "Which ring is currently on my finger, because the ancestral magic of his own house considered him either deceased or incapacitated and transferred the recognition. If I petition for a writ of examination, a formal review of his imprisonment status, what is the legal mechanism?" Bones looked at the silver ring. She was quiet for a long time. Long enough that Harry could hear the sounds of the ministry beyond her office, footsteps, distant voices, the hum of enchantment that ran through the building's walls. "A writ of examination," she said at last, "can be petitioned by a member of the prisoner's immediate family, by a recognized legal representative, or by," she paused, "by a lord of the prisoner's house, invoking the rights of noble house review." "Noble house review," Harry said. "What does that require?" "An application to this office," Bones said, setting out the grounds for examination. "Review of the original arrest documentation. If the documentation is irregular," she stopped. Her jaw set. "I pull the file today," she said. "If there's no trial record, then there is no legal conviction. And if there is no legal conviction, then the detention is irregular. An irregular detention of a British magical citizen," Harry said, "would be a significant problem for the ministry," Bones said flatly. "One that I, frankly, would like to know about regardless of who was asking." She pulled a fresh parchment toward her. "I'll pull Crouch's original documentation. This will take a few days. The Azkaban records are," she made a controlled noise of frustration, "not what they should be." "I'll wait," Harry said. "I imagine you will," said Bones, and there was something in her voice that Harry was fairly sure was respect, complicated as it was by everything else. She picked up her quill. "Is there anything else, Lord Potter?" "Not today," Harry said. He stood, thanked her, and left. In the corridor outside her office, McGonagall was waiting. She'd been there for the meeting, as his formal adult representative, though Harry had done all the talking. They walked together toward the lifts. "Well," McGonagall said, after a moment. "She'll pull the file," Harry said. "I know she will," McGonagall said. "What I was about to say is," she paused. "Are you all right? He's your godfather. If this works, if he did nothing wrong, then," she looked at him sideways, carefully. "Then I get a godfather," Harry said. He kept his voice level. "Yes. I've thought about that. And if it doesn't work out the way you're hoping?" Harry was quiet for a moment. "Then I find out the truth," he said. "Which is better than not knowing." McGonagall nodded slowly. "Yes," she said. "I suppose it is." Bones took 4 days. On the 4th day she sent a message, paper bird, ministry gold, that said, "Come to my office. Bring McGonagall." They went together on a Tuesday morning. Bones was standing behind her desk when they arrived, which told Harry something before she said a word. People stand when they've found something they can't sit with. "The arrest documentation for Sirius Orion Black," Bones said, "consists of a single parchment, signed by Bartemius Crouch Sr., dated November 3, 1981, authorizing transfer to Azkaban under Section 9 of the Emergency Wartime Powers Act." She looked at Harry. Section 9 allowed indefinite detention without trial for individuals suspected of serving Voldemort, and it had a 30-day sunset clause which expired on December 3, 1981. After which his detention became, Harry started. "Illegal," Bones said. "Yes." She sat down now, suddenly, as though the word had taken something out of her. 7 years, 3 months. There is no trial record. There are no formal charges. There is a single parchment signed by a man who was acting under wartime emergency provisions that expired a month after he signed it. She put her hands flat on the desk. I contacted Azkaban this morning. Sirius Black is alive. His condition is, she stopped. Not good. The gold ring was warm. Harry let it be warm. He kept his face even. What's the process? He asked. I can order an immediate release on the grounds of illegal detention, Bones said. I can do that today. What I can't do is restore 7 years. She looked at him steadily. I want you to understand, this is going to be visible. Politically. Crouch signed that parchment. There are people in this building who knew, or should have known. When I order the release, it will be public record within 48 hours, and the implications are yours to manage, Harry said. That's your job. My job is to get him out. Bones looked at him for a moment. Yes, she said. It is. She pulled a fresh parchment toward her and began to write with the focused efficiency of someone who had decided, and was now acting, and was not going to revisit the decision. He'll need medical attention. Azkaban prisoners typically, she didn't finish the sentence. He'll need somewhere to recover. I have properties, Harry said. You have properties, McGonagall repeated, with a tone that suggested she was still occasionally surprised by the scope of his resources. 12 Grimmauld Place is the closest black property to London, Harry said. I'll have it prepared. He paused. I'd like to be there when he's transferred. I know that's not standard. But, you're his family, Bones said, without looking up from her parchment. It's not standard. I'll arrange it. She dipped her quill again. Give me until tomorrow morning. Tomorrow morning turned out to be 5 o'clock, which Harry suspected was intentional. Bones was moving fast enough to get ahead of the political consequences, and before dawn transfers attracted less attention from ministry gossips. He was standing in the receiving ward of St. Mungo's Hospital, which was where Azkaban transfers went for medical evaluation, with McGonagall beside him and a Medowitch named Heloise who'd been briefed and had the bearing of someone who was good at not reacting to things. He had been waiting 30 minutes when the door opened. Harry had been thinking, in the abstract, about what a man looked like after 7 years in Azkaban. The history books mentioned Dementors in dry, procedural language, soul-feeding creatures, despair-inducing, guarding the wizarding prison. He'd read it and understood it intellectually. He understood it differently now. Sirius Black was tall, still tall, you could see it even now, the length of him, the frame that had probably been powerfully built once. He was 30 or so, Harry worked it out, knowing his father had been at school with him, knowing they'd all been 21 when it happened, but he looked older than that in the specific way of people who have been in the dark for a long time. He was thin in a way that went beyond diet. His hair, long and matted, was more gray than black. He was walking under his own power, which the Medowitch had apparently considered worth noting, and his eyes when he came through the door were aware. That was the thing. However the rest of him looked, his eyes were still working. Dark gray, like the silver ring's metal, moving quickly around the room, taking stock, the eyes of someone who had survived by never fully switching off. They found Harry and stopped. Harry stood very still and let them. He didn't know what Sirius saw when he looked at him. His father's hair, his mother's eyes, some combination of both and something that was neither. He didn't know what a man who'd spent 7 years in Azkaban felt when he saw the child of the best friend he'd lost, standing in a hospital receiving ward at 5 in the morning. Whatever it was, it moved through Sirius's face like weather, quick, complex, too fast to name any one part of it. And then it settled into something simpler. James's boy, Sirius said. His voice was rough from disuse. Lily's eyes. I've heard that, Harry said. A breath that might have been a laugh from someone who'd remembered how. You sprung me. The law sprung you, Harry said. I just asked the law to look. Sirius looked at him for another moment. The Medowitch was hovering with professional patience. McGonagall was doing the thing she did where she stood slightly back and let things happen. "You have their rings," Sirius said, looking at Harry's hands. His voice had changed, gone quieter. "All four?" "Yes," Harry said. "James used to say," he stopped. Swallowed. The rough voice got rougher. "He used to say those rings were supposed to find the right Potter eventually. Said his dad told him they'd been missing since before anyone could remember." He looked at Harry's hands for another long moment. "I've had 7 years of dementors and nightmares and there's a lot of things I can't think about clearly, but I can see those rings just fine." "Can you walk?" Harry asked. "I've been walking for 30 years, Sirius said, with a shade of the dryness that Harry suspected had once been reflexive and now took effort. 12 Grimmauld Place, Harry said. Black family house. It needs work, Creature has been in charge of it, which I'm told is a disaster, Sirius said, with feeling. Creature is, yes, a disaster is accurate. He paused. You know about Creature. I've been doing a lot of reading, Harry said. Sirius looked at him. 30, wrecked, standing in a hospital ward at 5 in the morning with 7 years of Azkaban in his face and the particular expression of a man who is being confronted with a situation that has no category in his existing experience. He turned slightly and looked at McGonagall. Minerva. Sirius, McGonagall said, in a voice that was mostly even. It's good to see you. It's good to be, he stopped. Something crossed his face. Yeah, he said finally. Yeah, it is. The Medowitch stepped forward then, gently and professionally, and Harry sat down in one of the ward chairs and watched Sirius get examined with the patient thoroughness of someone who was exhausted and cooperating anyway, and he felt the gold ring warm against his finger, and he thought, all right, then. 12 Grimmauld Place was exactly as bad as Sirius had suggested, and Creature was exactly as bad as Sirius had implied, and the next week was loud and complicated and smelled of dust and old enchantments and the specific acidity of a house that had been kept by someone who hated its new owner on principle. Creature was ancient and small and had the eyes of an animal that has been mistreated so long it has developed a philosophical framework for mistreating others. He was not immediately cooperative. He was cooperative eventually, but only after Harry had a conversation with him that McGonagall did not attend and that Harry did not fully describe afterward, and which resulted in Creature cleaning 3 rooms with aggressive thoroughness while making sounds under his breath that conveyed his feelings about the arrangement without technically being insubordinate. The house itself was, interesting, in the way of something that had been built by people with strong opinions and left to accumulate history. Dark, yes. Cluttered. The Black family portraits were a particular challenge, most of them containing occupants who had strong feelings about the current situation and expressed those feelings at volume. One portrait of a very large woman in a frame that appeared to be permanently attached to the wall in the front hallway screamed about blood traders whenever anyone walked past. Sirius sealed her curtains with a charm on day 2 and said, "That's my mother. She's been like that since 1985, in a tone that managed to convey both decades of complicated feelings and a total absence of regret about the curtains." He was recovering. Slowly, in the way of someone whose body was ahead of their mind, or possibly the other way around. He slept a great deal. He ate with the careful deliberateness of someone relearning the connection between hunger and food. He was quiet for long stretches, and then suddenly, sharply, fully himself in a way that was startling in its clarity, the wit cutting through like light through a gap, the loyalty to Harry's father visible in every second thing he said. They learned each other awkwardly, the way of 2 people who share a great deal of context and none of the normal scaffolding of a relationship. Harry was 9. Sirius was 30 and fragile in ways he was working hard not to show. Neither of them had any experience with what they were supposed to be to each other. You don't have to be anything, Harry told him, on day 4, when Sirius had apologized for the 3rd time in one afternoon for being, as he put it, a wreck. I'm your godfather, Sirius said. I know what you are, Harry said. You don't have to be good at it yet. Sirius looked at him across the kitchen table. They'd gotten the kitchen functional, which felt like an achievement, with an expression that Harry couldn't fully interpret and suspected had James Potter all through it. "You're terrifying," Sirius said. "I'm 9, Harry said. "That's exactly what I mean," Sirius said, and there was something in his voice then, beneath the roughness, that was the beginning of something warmer. Something that might, given time, become what it was supposed to be. Harry pushed a plate of toast toward him. Sirius ate it. On day 7, McGonagall came to Grimmauld Place for a meeting that had been scheduled but which Harry had also been using as a deadline, a self-imposed checkpoint for where things stood and what came next. She sat in the kitchen, which was now genuinely habitable, and accepted tea from Kreacher, who provided it with the suppressed rage of someone who was being polite under duress. Sirius sat at the end of the table, which Harry had told him he didn't have to be present for and which Sirius had ignored. "The political fallout from the release is manageable," McGonagall reported. "Bones has been careful. She's framed it as a procedural correction rather than a scandal, which has blunted some of the worst of it. Crouch is retired and his health is poor, so that particular political fire is smoldering rather than blazing." She paused. "Malfoy has been very quiet." "That worries me more than if he were loud," Harry said. "Yes," McGonagall agreed. "He's regrouping." She set down her teacup. "The full Wizengamot sitting is in 3 weeks. The High King motion will need to come to the floor at that sitting," Harry said. "If we wait, they'll build more opposition. 3 weeks gives us enough time to court the votes we need but not enough time for Malfoy to build a coalition that can sustain a 2/3 block. You need 23 votes against to fail," McGonagall said. "He currently has 11 reliable negatives. He needs 12 more. He won't get them from Greengrass or Longbottom," Harry said. "Ogden is solid. Bones will vote in favor because the law requires it and she is incapable of voting against the law. That's 4 anchors on our side plus the abstentions." He was thinking through the tally the way the bronze ring arranged things, in columns, in weights, in calculated likelihoods. "There's a family named Abbott who've been undeclared. And the Bones family seat votes with Amelia by convention." "I can speak to the Abbotts," McGonagall said. "What about Shafiq?" Sirius said, from his end of the table. Both Harry and McGonagall looked at him. He had a cup of tea in both hands, and he looked faintly surprised at himself for speaking, like someone who'd been quiet long enough that the habit of speaking up had gotten rusty. "Shafiq family," he said. "Ancient family, old seat, they've been unrepresented for 2 years since the current Lord Shafiq's father died. He's been avoiding the Wizengamot because," he paused, his eyes going distant for a moment in the way they still sometimes did, the Azkaban habit of losing the thread. He pulled it back. "Because Malfoy pushed him out during the war. Old grudge. He's exactly the kind of vote Malfoy can't get and can't afford." Harry looked at him. "Do you know him?" "We were at school together," Sirius said. "He won't have great feelings about me right now, given the last 7 years of public narrative. But he might," he paused. "He might talk to me." Something shifted in his face. "If I asked him." The first offer. The first small reaching out toward the shape of what a godfather could be, not protection, not authority, but usefulness. Contributing something. Bringing himself back into the work. Harry looked at him steadily. "When you're ready," he said. "Not pushing. Not pulling." Sirius nodded once. "When I'm ready," he agreed. McGonagall was watching them both with an expression she'd schooled into professional neutrality and which had, around the edges, something that looked like cautious relief. 3 weeks, Harry said. 3 weeks, she confirmed. Sirius drank his tea. Outside, Grimmauld Place moved through its morning routines. The portrait curtains stayed closed, Kreacher banged something distant in what might have been protest or might have been cleaning, the old house settling into the strange new shape of being inhabited by people who had nothing to lose and quite a lot to do. Harry looked at the 4 rings on his hands. 3 weeks until the full Wisengamot. 3 weeks until Harry Potter, Lord of 4 ancient and noble houses, stood up before the full body of magical Britain's governing institution and said, I am here. I have always been here. And things are going to change. He could wait 3 weeks. Chapter 4, The court convenes. The full Wisengamot sat on the third Thursday of every month in the main chamber, which was different from the special session chamber in the way that a cathedral is different from a chapel, same fundamental purpose, different scale of intention. Harry had seen drawings of it in one of McGonagall's reference books. The drawings had not prepared him adequately. The chamber was circular, the benches rising in 7 tiers around the central floor in a full 360 degrees, so that whoever stood at the center was surrounded on all sides. The ceiling was 40 feet up and enchanted to show the sky above the ministry, whatever sky existed at the moment, real-time, which today was a grey November overcast that pressed down on the proceedings with a certain meteorological opinion. There were over 200 members in their seats when Harry walked in. He felt their attention land on him like a physical thing, 200 pairs of eyes, the accumulated weight of an institution that had governed magical Britain for 6 centuries, all of it suddenly oriented toward a 9-year-old in good robes who was walking to the center of the floor as though he'd done it before. He hadn't done it before. But the stone ring was steady under his finger, and the bronze ring was cataloguing faces and positions, and the gold ring was warm with something that felt ancestral, generations of Potters who had stood in rooms like this, maybe not this room, but rooms with this quality of weight. And the silver ring was doing what it always did, which was strip away everything that wasn't relevant and leave only the clear cold edge of the moment. He took his position at the center of the floor. Looked up. McGonagall was in the 3rd tier, House Observers section. Sirius was beside her. He'd been allowed a provisional seat as a petitioning member of Harry's delegation, which Bones had signed off on with the air of a woman adding one more item to her list of precedent-setting decisions this month. He looked better than he had in St. Mungo's. Still thin, still carrying the grey in his hair, but his back was straight and he was wearing new robes, black, well cut, the black family crest at the collar, and his eyes when they found Harry's were sharp and steady. Blackwell and Rake were at the petitioner's table on Harry's left. Lucius Malfoy was in the 2nd tier, front bench, center seat, which was the most prominent position available to him and which he occupied with the relaxed authority of a man who had been the most important person in this room for 20 years and intended to remain so. He was watching Harry with an expression of polite, interested neutrality that had cost him something to construct and was very good. Harry met his eyes for exactly half a second and looked away, not as a concession but because he'd seen what he needed to. Dumbledore, in the Chief Warlock's seat, elevated above the benches on a separate platform, looked down at Harry with an expression that Harry now had 3 weeks of additional context for. The warmth was real. The concern was real. The very slight, very controlled quality of a man who was watching something he had planned around become something he can no longer plan around, that was also real, and Harry was grateful to McGonagall for teaching him to see it. The full sitting of the Wisengamot is convened, Dumbledore said, his voice filling the chamber with that deep, warm authority. We have one constitutional motion on the agenda today, registered and verified per the proceedings of the special session of, he named the date, at which the ancestral rings were confirmed by Veritas Ward. The motion before the full body is the formal claim to the title of High King of Magical Britain, as provided for under Clause 7 of the 1289 Founding Charter, by Harry James Potter, Lord of the ancient and noble houses of Potter, Black, Peverell, and Ravenclaw. He paused. Lord Potter, you may address the chamber. 200 people, completely silent. Harry had prepared a speech. He'd written it, revised it 4 times, practiced it in the kitchen at Grimmauld Place while Creature pretended not to listen and Sirius sat at the table with a cup of tea and told him, with bracing honesty, which parts were too long. He didn't use the speech. He looked up at the tiers of faces, old families and ministry appointees and people who'd had opinions about him since before he could remember having opinions about himself, and he said, the founding charter of this body describes the High King's role in one sentence. The King's peace shall be kept by one whose blood carries the weight of all 4 houses, and whose will serves the whole over the part. That's it. One sentence. He let it sit. I'm not standing here because I want to rule anything. I'm standing here because the rings on my hands say I'm the person those words describe, and because the chamber has already verified that's true, and because the alternative, leaving a constitutional provision dormant while the people it was meant to protect are being ignored, seems worse. He paused. I'm 9. I know that. I'll be 9 for another 11 months. What I'm asking this body to formally recognize today isn't my ability to govern, it's my right to exist as what I am. The rest can be built as we go. Silence. And then, from the second tier, Lucius Malfoy said, in a voice of absolute pleasantness, a moving statement. Lord Potter's eloquence is, as ever, remarkable for his age. He rose, and 200 heads swiveled toward him with the ease of long habit. However, the chamber would be failing in its duty if it did not examine, carefully, the practical implications of vesting a constitutional monarchy title, dormant for 3 centuries, in a child who has been in the wizarding world for a matter of weeks. The title is vested by bloodline, not by familiarity with the wizarding world, Blackwell said from the petitioner's table. Indeed, Malfoy said, not even looking at Blackwell. And I'm sure the bloodline is precisely as Lord Potter claims. The Veritas ward is not in question. A pause, precisely waited. What is in question is whether this chamber, in its wisdom, believes that activating a 3-century-old constitutional provision on the basis of a charter clause that has never been tested in practice, invoked by a minor who has spent 8 years in the Muggle world and has no experience of governance, of magical tradition, of the complex diplomatic landscape that the title of High King would require him to navigate, serves the interests of magical Britain. He let that hang. I say this with no disrespect to Lord Potter. I say it as a member of this body who takes seriously the stability that depends on our institutions functioning properly. It was good. Harry had known it would be good. Malfoy was not stupid, and 3 weeks had given him time to refine his position from obstruction into something that looked, on the surface, like reason. The chamber was listening. Some faces on the upper tiers had the look of people who found the argument persuasive or at least plausible. Harry waited. Malfoy sat. Lord Potter. Dumbledore said, from the chief warlock's seat. Would you care to respond? Yes, Harry said. He looked at Malfoy directly. Lord Malfoy's argument is essentially that I'm too inexperienced to be trusted with this title. I'd like to ask a question. He looked up at the tiers. How many people in this chamber, at the time they first held power in this room, were fully prepared for it? How many of you walked in here knowing everything you needed to know? He let that sit for exactly long enough. The title doesn't require me to be finished. It requires me to be right. The rings say I'm right. The charter says the rings are sufficient. And the precedent, he looked at Blackwell. Blackwell placed 3 documents on the petitioner's table. Rake rose and carried copies up to the bench officer, who distributed them. There are 3 historical cases of underage lordship in the Gringotts records, Harry said. 2 I identified through inheritance law research. The third, he glanced toward Malfoy's position. The third was argued before this chamber in 1743 and decided in favor of the minor claimant by 41 votes to 9. The lead advocate for the opposition in that case was a Lord Septimus Malfoy. A beat. He lost. The chamber made a sound. Not laughter. More like the collective intake of breath that precedes a response, and from the various faces visible in the tiers, different people were having different responses, but the general quality of the moment had shifted. The argument had tilted. Malfoy's expression did not change. That was the thing about Lucius Malfoy, he was too good to change expression when a room shifted against him, too controlled to give the chamber the satisfaction of seeing it land. But Harry had been watching his hands, which were folded on the bench in front of him, and the very slight pressure of the right thumb against the left index finger was the only external sign of the adjustment happening behind those pale eyes. The precedents are noted, Dumbledore said, from above, with a measured calm. Are there further objections? There were 3 more, from 3 different members. Harry handled them in sequence, the first about the practical mechanics of a minor king's governance, to which he outlined the council structure he'd been developing with McGonagall and Sirius, the second about the treaty obligations referenced in the charter, to which Rake produced Gringotts' pre-prepared analysis, the third from a small, pink-robed woman on the 4th tier who suggested, in a voice that had the quality of something sweet over something sour, that the ministry might want to convene a welfare panel to assess Lord Potter's fitness for the last welfare argument before this chamber, Harry said, cutting in cleanly before Blackwell could respond, was made at the special session 3 weeks ago by Lord Malfoy, and the chamber's response to it involved the opening of a financial investigation by the head of law enforcement. He looked up at the pink-robed woman with an expression that was entirely polite and entirely unapologetic. "I'd be happy to discuss my welfare further, if the chamber believes there are new facts to consider." The pink-robed woman, Umbridge, he remembered. McGonagall's description had included the word danger somewhere around the 3rd sentence, and Harry had filed it accordingly, went very still, and her small eyes did something that lived in the distance between embarrassment and threat, and then she sat back and said nothing more. Bones, sitting to Dumbledore's right, was watching Harry with the focused, somewhat unsettled attention of a woman who kept recalibrating and finding her recalibrations insufficient. "I'd like to speak," said a voice from the 4th tier. Harry turned. Augusta Longbottom was a formidable woman in her 60s with a hat that could have been classified as a defensive structure and a voice that had the quality of something that had been carved from stone over a long period. She rose with the deliberateness of someone who understood that their standing in a room was worth taking her time about. "I have sat on this body for 32 years, she said. "In those 32 years I have seen the charter invoked as an argument precisely 0 times, because there was no one to invoke it. I have watched this institution," she paused, and the pause had weight. "Drift. Make choices that served convenience over principle. Fail the families that depend on it. The Black family." She looked briefly toward the observers' gallery, toward Sirius. "The Potter family." She looked down at Harry. "I am not a sentimental woman. But I know what the charter was written to provide. A center. A point of reference when this body loses its own." She looked around the tiers. "Lord Potter is 9. He will not be 9 forever. The question before us is not whether he is ready to rule today. It is whether we are ready to stop pretending we don't need what the charter provides." She sat. The chamber was quiet in a different way now. The quality of silence had changed, less like the silence before argument and more like the silence of a room making up its mind. Griselda Marchbanks, ancient and small in the top tier, raised her hand. "I'll vote in favor," she said, with the casual authority of someone who has been voting in this chamber since before most of its current members were born. "Get on with it." A ripple of something through the tiers. Not exactly amusement. More like the sound a room makes when a logjam breaks. Dumbledore called the vote. It was not close. 143 in favor, 31 against, the remainder abstaining. The 31 included Malfoy's block, Umbridge, and a cluster of ministry appointees from the upper tiers. Harry noted all 31 and kept the list. The clerk's quill scratched in the ledger. Harry James Potter, Lord of the ancient and noble houses of Potter, Black, Peverell, and Ravenclaw, is hereby recognized by the full Wisingamot as High King of Magical Britain, in accordance with the 1289 Founding Charter, Clause 7, Section 3. The title is confirmed by ancestral ring verification and majority vote of the full body. The King's peace applies from the date of this sitting. The clerk read it aloud in a voice that had the quality of a man reading something he'd been a civil servant long enough to read without expression and was finding this one a genuine challenge to that discipline. Dumbledore looked down from the Chief Warlock's platform at Harry, and his expression had settled into something genuine and complicated that Harry didn't have a full vocabulary for yet. Pride and sadness and the specific quality of a man reckoning with consequences of his own choices, visible only because Harry had been taught to look. "The motion carries," Dumbledore said. "The body recognizes the High King." Silence for one more beat. And then Augusta Longbottom began to clap, and it spread through the tiers in a wave that wasn't unanimous but was substantial, and Harry stood at the center of the circular chamber with 200 people around him and the grey November sky above and the four rings steady and warm and cool and deep on his hands, and thought, right. Now the work actually starts. He found Malfoy in the corridor outside the chamber. Or rather, Malfoy found him. This was deliberate on both sides. Harry had anticipated it and slowed his pace on the way out. Malfoy had waited with the particular patience of a man who has something to say and intends to say it on his own schedule. McGonagall was 4 steps behind Harry. Malfoy's wife and his associates were not with him. "Lord Potter," Malfoy said. His voice was precisely what it had been in the chamber, smooth, measured, entirely controlled. He was taller than Harry by nearly 2 feet and managed not to make that a statement. "Lord Malfoy," Harry said. They stood in the ministry corridor, grey stone walls, moving portraits, the distant sound of the lifts, and looked at each other. This was the first time they'd actually been in speaking distance, close enough to read expression rather than body language. Malfoy's eyes were pale grey and very intelligent, and what Harry found in them was not the contempt he'd expected but something more interesting, appraisal. Genuine, careful appraisal, with no conclusion reached yet. "You argued well today," Malfoy said. "The 1743 precedent was well chosen." "Thank you," Harry said. "Your procedural arguments were well constructed. If the chamber had been more politically aligned with your position, the welfare framing might have worked." Something moved in Malfoy's expression. Surprise, controlled immediately. He hadn't expected to be analyzed back. "You're not what I anticipated," he said. "What did you anticipate?" Malfoy considered him. "Something more, reflexive," he said. "The wizarding world has a particular narrative about you. I prepared for a child who fit the narrative." "That seems like a planning error," Harry said pleasantly. The very edges of Malfoy's mouth moved. Not a smile, not quite, but the ghost of an acknowledgement that something like a smile might be appropriate. "Yes," he said. "It was." A pause. "I voted against your motion," Malfoy said, which was not news and both of them knew it. "I want to be clear that this was not personal. You are politically inconvenient in ways that have nothing to do with your character, which I am, apparently, not yet in a position to properly judge." "Politically inconvenient how?" Harry asked, because the bronze ring wanted the full picture and because asking was faster than inferring. Malfoy looked at him steadily. "My family spent 20 years building a position in this world," he said. "A High King is a constitutional anomaly who supersedes 20 years of careful work simply by existing. That is inconvenient. I am honest enough to say so." Harry thought about that. He thought about it the way the bronze ring encouraged, not as a threat to be countered but as information to be used. A man who acknowledged inconvenience honestly was a man who worked with reality rather than around it. That was different from an enemy. That was something more complicated and more potentially useful. "Lord Malfoy," he said, "what would it take for your political position to not require my political failure?" Silence. Malfoy looked at him for a long, specific moment. "That is a remarkably direct question," he said. "I'm told I get that from my mother," Harry said. Another of those almost movements at the corner of his mouth. "Your mother was formidable," Malfoy said, with the careful acknowledgement of a man who fought on the wrong side and knows it. "She was not what the narratives about her suggest." "No one is," Harry said. Malfoy was quiet for a moment. "I will think about your question," he said. "I don't have an answer today. But I will think about it." He paused. "I would suggest, for whatever it is worth, and you are free to value it at whatever you determine appropriate, that the 31 who voted against you today are not all of one piece. Some are mine. Some are Umbridge's, which is a different thing entirely, and a more dangerous one." His voice was flat on the word dangerous. She has ministry backing and institutional reach, and she has been building something for 3 years that does not advertise its shape. He held Harry's gaze. I don't like you specifically. But I dislike what she's building considerably more. He inclined his head, precisely the correct depth for lord-to-lord courtesy, no more, and walked away down the ministry corridor, his robes moving with the unhurried precision of a man who had never been in a hurry because he'd never had to be. Harry watched him go. That was interesting, McGonagall said, from directly behind him. Yes, Harry said. He's not the worst enemy to have. He's not an ally either. Not yet, Harry said. McGonagall made a sound that suggested she was deciding whether to be concerned by that or not. Come on. Sirius is waiting by the lifts and he's been standing for 40 minutes, which is still more than the Medowitch recommended. They went back to Grimmauld Place in a mood that was, not celebratory exactly. Too aware of what came next for that. But the kitchen that evening had a quality of something that had been earned, sitting in the warmth of the fire, and the smell of the meal Creature had produced with the aggressive professionalism of someone determined to do an excellent job entirely against his will. Sirius had talked to Shafiq. He reported this over dinner with the slightly careful manner of someone who had done something difficult and was still processing whether it had gone well. He was, a pause. He was angry, at first. About the narrative. About the trial thing, because the public version of events for 7 years has been that I was guilty, and he believed it. Sirius turned his fork over in his hand. I didn't try to defend myself. I just told him what actually happened and let him decide what to do with it. And? Harry asked. He voted in favor, Sirius said. For his own reasons. Malfoy shut him out during the war, like I said. But, he looked across the table at Harry. He asked about you. About what you were actually like. I told him. He paused. He wants to meet you. Set it up, Harry said. Already did, Sirius said, with the shadow of a grin that Harry was starting to recognize as his default expression when he'd managed something he was quietly pleased about. Next week. McGonagall, who had stayed for dinner without being asked and had stopped apologizing about it after the 3rd time, looked between them with the expression she wore when something was working better than she'd planned for. She reached for the salt without comment. The 31 who voted against, Harry said. I've been thinking about the Malfoy conversation. So have I, McGonagall said. He warned you about Umbridge. Why? Sirius said. His voice had gone flatter. He knew Umbridge from the pre-Azkaban world, whatever she'd been building in the years since, he knew the foundation of it, and his expression said none of what he knew was comfortable. Because she's a threat to him too, Harry said. Whatever she's building, he said, it doesn't advertise its shape. That means it's grown beyond what he can see, and what he can't see he can't control, and Malfoy is a man who controls things. He turned his fork in his hand, mirroring Sirius's earlier gesture without noticing. He's not going to ally with us. But he's given us a direction to look. Umbridge has a seat on the Wisengamot's Judicial Subcommittee, McGonagall said. She's been on it for 3 years. She's also on the Educational Standards Review Board, which has been making noise about curriculum reform. She paused, with the specific tone of a professor who has opinions about curriculum reform being made by politicians. She has access to Hogwarts governance through that. She'd want more than access, Harry said. Yes, McGonagall said, quietly. She would. Sirius was looking at the table with the focused expression of someone connecting things. She was a junior Crouch appointee, he said. During the war. She processed detention orders. Including, he stopped. She was the one who signed off on the emergency detention paperwork. The Azkaban transfers. He looked up. I remember her signature. The kitchen went very quiet. She signed your paperwork, Harry said. She signed a lot of paperwork, Sirius said. That's the thing about her. She's never the one holding the wand. She's always the one with the form in triplicate. He paused. But the form in triplicate is what made it legal. Or, what made it look legal. Harry thought about that. The bronze ring arranged it alongside what Malfoy had said, alongside what McGonagall had said about the educational board, alongside the 31 votes that weren't all of one piece. She'll make a move, he said. The title recognition today is a threat to her, whatever she's building. She'll want to test the limits of it. He looked at McGonagall. What can the High King title actually do? Constitutionally. The Charter. McGonagall reached into her robes and produced a bookmarked copy of the Charter. She'd been carrying it for weeks, Harry had noticed, and opened it to a page she'd clearly spent time with. The King can convene an extraordinary Wisengamot session without the Chief Warlock's authorization. The King can call for a formal review of any ongoing institutional investigation. The King can veto ministry legislation, once, per bill, and require a full Wisengamot override to proceed. She looked up. And the King can issue royal decrees on matters of civil rights and personal liberty that take immediate effect. Civil rights and personal liberty, Harry repeated. That's the one that matters most, Sirius said, quietly. He was looking at Harry. That's the one no one's had access to for 300 years. Harry turned the Charter clause over in his mind. Civil rights and personal liberty. He thought about the people who had been hurt by the gap between what the law said and what powerful people made it do. He thought about Sirius, 7 years. He thought about his parents, dead and there will never read. He thought about the Shafiq family, pushed out. He thought about the quiet architecture of a system that had been built to benefit the people who built it. Not today, he said. Not yet. I need to understand what I'm doing before I start issuing decrees. But, he looked at the Charter. I want a full constitutional briefing. Everything the title can do, every mechanism, every limit. He looked at Blackwell, who was also, apparently, staying for dinner. Can you prepare that? It'll take a week, Blackwell said, around a mouthful of Creature's stew, which was extraordinary and which Creature had been furious to discover they appreciated. Take a week, Harry said. There's also the matter of your formal residence, McGonagall said. You can't continue to live at the Dursleys. Legally the guardianship has transferred to the Wisengamot Trust, so the blood protection question is now a trust matter rather than a personal one. But in practical terms, she looked around the kitchen. Is Grimmauld Place suitable? He's not living here, Sirius said, immediately. Everyone looked at him. He met Harry's eyes. Not because I don't want, he stopped. Started again. This house is a wreck and it's dark and it has my mother's portrait and it's not. He ran a hand through his hair, which was still long but somewhat less matted. You should have something better than this. You should have something that's actually yours. Potter Manor, Harry said. Sirius was quiet for a moment. It was damaged, he said. In Godric's Hollow. The night, he stopped again. Damaged, not destroyed, Harry said. Gringotts has the property survey on file. It needs work. Significant work. But it's standing. He looked at Sirius. It's mine. And it's ours, if you want it to be. The kitchen fire crackled. Creature made a sound from the scullery that might, in a different creature, have been emotional but was in Creature most likely indigestion. Sirius looked at him for a long time with those grey eyes that had too much in them still, too much of Azkaban, too much of the war, too much of the night that had taken James and Lily and broken the world in that particular way that some breakages can't be fully repaired. But underneath all of that, something else. Something that Harry recognized, because it was the same thing that had made the gold ring feel like recognition. Family. Potter Manor, Sirius said. Yeah. A pause. Yeah, I'd like that. McGonagall picked up her teacup and looked at the fire and said nothing, which was its own kind of contribution. The response from Privet Drive was brief and, unexpectedly, almost a relief. Harry had written to the Dursleys after the Wisengamot trust transfer, because they were legally entitled to know the guardianship had changed and because he had decided, after considerable thought, that he would be the kind of person who handled things properly even when he didn't strictly have to. The letter was formal and factual and contained no accusations and no expressions of feeling, because both of those things could wait until after the legal investigation had concluded. Vernon's response was 3 lines and a signature, and the 3 lines essentially said, "Fine, yes, don't involve us, goodbye." Harry read it in the kitchen at Grimmauld Place and felt the gold ring go briefly, peculiarly warm, not with grief, not with anger, not with the complicated not love that 8 years in a cupboard might reasonably have produced, but with something more like the sensation of setting down a weight you'd been carrying so long you'd stopped noticing the shape of it. He folded the letter neatly and put it in the folder where he kept documents that might matter later, and went back to work. The work, in the 2 weeks following the full sitting, was substantial and varied and occasionally interrupted by things he hadn't planned for. The Lord Shafiq meeting went well. Ibrahim Shafiq was 40, precise, deeply skeptical, and had a handshake like a structural test. He sat across from Harry in a small restaurant in Horizon Alley that McGonagall had recommended, and he asked questions for 90 minutes with the focused, slightly aggressive thoroughness of a man who had been burned by trust before and had developed a rigorous pre-screening process. Harry answered every question directly, including the ones that were uncomfortable, about the limits of what he could actually do, about the political landscape's complexity, about the fact that he was 9 and did not have all the answers. He had learned, somewhere in the past months, that the most effective thing he could do in a room was refuse to pretend to be more than he was. The rings gave him legitimacy. The honesty was what built trust. By the end of the 90 minutes, Shafiq had shifted in his chair by perhaps half an inch, which Harry gathered was his equivalent of a warm embrace. "I'll support the constitutional agenda," Shafiq said, "on the condition that it includes a formal review of the ministry's conduct during the post-war period." Crouch's emergency powers. He looked at Harry steadily. "There are other families who were damaged by how the war's ending was managed. Not just Black." A pause. "You understand what I'm saying?" "Yes," Harry said. "Are you in contact with them?" "Some of them." "I'd like those names," Harry said, "when you're ready to share them." Shafiq nodded once, with the economy of a man who considers gestures a form of expenditure. "I'll be in touch." Sirius, walking back with Harry toward the tube station afterward, he'd come as Harry's companion rather than representative, on Doctor's orders limiting his standing time and his own private recognition that the meetings were Harry's to run, said, "That went better than I expected." "He's honest," Harry said. "Honest people are usually manageable." "That's either very mature or slightly alarming," Sirius said. "Can it be both?" "With you?" Sirius said, with the grin that was becoming less effortful. "Definitely both." They walked in companionable quiet for a moment, down the alley toward the leaky cauldron entrance. The November air was sharp and cold and the alley was busy with late afternoon shoppers, and Harry walked through it the way he'd been walking through it for weeks now, not as a visitor, not as a tourist, but as someone it belonged to, which it did. "Can I ask you something?" Sirius said. "Yes," Harry said. "Does it ever?" He paused. "Do you ever wish it was different? That none of this had happened and you were just a kid?" He looked sidelong at Harry. "Because I look at you sometimes and I think, he shouldn't have to be doing this. And then I think, he's doing it better than anyone I've seen in 20 years. Harry walked a few more steps before he answered. "I used to think about different," he said. "In the cupboard, before the rings. I thought about it a lot." He paused. "But different means different parents. Different means no rings. Different means," he turned the gold ring on his finger. "I'd rather be this than nothing," he said. "And I'd rather be doing this than waiting for someone else to do it." He looked up at Sirius. "Is that alarming?" "No," Sirius said quietly. "It sounds exactly like James." He swallowed. "And Lily. Both at once, which I didn't think was possible in one person." They walked through the leaky cauldron and out into Charing Cross Road, and the city closed around them, and Harry turned his face into the cold wind and thought about Potter Manor being restored, about the constitutional briefing from Blackwell, about the 31 votes and Umbridge and the shape of whatever she was building that Malfoy couldn't see. He thought about Hogwarts, which was 2 years away. He thought about Voldemort, who was not fully gone, which everyone was pretending wasn't relevant and which Harry knew was the largest stone he hadn't yet turned over. He thought about all of it, the whole complicated landscape of it, and he felt the 4 rings on his hands, warm, steady, deep, sharp, and what he felt about all of it was not dread. It was something much more like readiness. Chapter 5, The ones who would rule him. Potter Manor had good bones. That was Sirius's assessment, delivered on a grey December morning while standing in what had been the main entrance hall and was currently a room with 3 intact walls, a partial ceiling, and a floor that was entirely sound except for the northeast corner where something had burned through during the attack 9 years ago and left a scar in the stone that went down 6 inches. Good bones, Harry repeated. Structurally, yeah. Sirius was looking up at the ceiling gap with the expression of a man doing mental arithmetic. The foundation is solid. Your grandfather built this place in the 50s and he was thorough about it. Whatever Voldemort threw at it that night, he stopped briefly, the way he still sometimes stopped at that name, less than he had a month ago. It hit the upper floors. The core held. Harry looked around the entrance hall. The walls that remained had portraits, most of them damaged, the frames cracked, the paintings themselves faded or partially destroyed. One, near the staircase, was entirely intact, a man in his 30s with dark hair and hazel eyes and an expression of cheerful stubbornness that Harry had seen recently, in certain angles of his godfather's descriptions. His grandfather. Fleamont Potter looked down at Harry from the portrait with an expression that had been waiting 9 years and had apparently decided not to make a fuss about the wait. There you are, he said. Here I am, Harry said. You have James's hair. Worse, if anything. I've heard that before, Harry said. Fleamont's portrait gaze moved to the rings on Harry's hands, and something in his painted face shifted, deep satisfaction, the kind that comes from a very long wait ending properly. Those have been gone for 30 years, he said. Your grandmother and I spent a decade looking. He paused. Where were they? Root cellar under a dead oak tree in Surrey, Harry said. Fleamont processed that. Well, he said, after a moment. That's unexpected. Everything has been unexpected, Harry said, fairly. The restoration was being managed by a firm of magical architects that Gringotts had recommended, 4 witches and a wizard who'd shown up that morning with an attitude of professional excitement that suggested they didn't often get a commission like this, and who were currently moving through the house with measuring instruments and low, technical conversation that Harry left them to. He and Sirius had done a walk-through first, room by room, noting what was salvageable and what needed replacing, and it had been a strange kind of experience, a house Harry had never seen, full of things that were unmistakably his family, the wreckage of a life interrupted so completely that the interruption had become the primary thing. His parents' bedroom was on the 2nd floor, one wall largely gone, opening to the winter sky. The furniture was ruined. But on the wall adjacent to the gap, sheltered by the angle of the remaining structure, was a row of photographs in frames that had somehow stayed on their hooks through everything. Sirius had stopped walking when they got there. Harry stood beside him and looked at the photographs. James and Lily at what was clearly a wedding, laughing at something outside the frame. A younger Sirius with his arm around James's shoulders, both of them in Hogwarts robes, in front of a fireplace that Harry could see, faintly, was the Gryffindor common room. A photograph of a baby, small, dark-haired, already demonstrating the hair problem, being held by a woman with red hair and a face that Harry had seen in dreams his whole life without knowing what he was dreaming about. He took the photograph off the wall carefully. His mother was looking up at the baby and laughing at something, and the baby reached up and grabbed a fistful of her hair, and she laughed harder, and the whole thing looped on a silent 8-second circuit, and Harry watched it until Sirius put a hand on his shoulder, briefly, and then they went back downstairs. The photograph went into his bag. He'd find it a proper frame when the manor was restored. Blackwell delivered the constitutional briefing on a Tuesday, in the kitchen at Grimmauld Place, which had become the unofficial headquarters of what Sirius had taken to calling the King's Council with the specific tone of someone who found the phrase both genuinely impressive and genuinely absurd. It was Blackwell, Rake, McGonagall, Sirius, and Harry, with Creature providing an elaborate spread of food that he'd apparently prepared as a form of protest against the proceedings and which was, as always, extraordinary. Blackwell had organized the briefing into 3 categories: what the title could do immediately, what required Wizengamot cooperation, and what was theoretically available but had never been tested. He walked through it with the brisk efficiency of a man who had spent a week condensing 6 centuries of constitutional law into something usable and was quietly pleased with the result. The immediate powers were significant. Royal decrees on civil rights and liberty, as McGonagall had identified. The ability to compel testimony from any ministry official before an extraordinary Wizengamot session. The right to appoint a formal royal council, up to 7 members, whose status gave them standing before any ministry body without requiring independent credentials. And, the one that made Sirius set down his teacup with a small, specific sound, the right to formally pardon individuals for offenses against the crown, which in the original 1289 context meant any offense tried before the Wizengamot. That's broader than it looks, Rake said, picking up from Blackwell. A royal pardon under the founding charter applies retroactively. It doesn't just prevent future prosecution, it expunges the original record. Sirius was very still. Harry looked at him. Sirius. There was no trial, Sirius said. There's nothing to pardon. Bones already handled, the illegal detention, yes, Harry said. But the public record still exists. Newspaper archives. Ministry files. The official narrative that you were a Death Eater and a traitor, that's in documents. It hasn't been formally corrected. He paused. A royal decree doesn't need the Wizengamot. It takes effect immediately. He looked at Blackwell. What do I need to do? Sign the decree with the royal seal, which is the 4 rings acting in concert, they'll imprint on the parchment, and file it with the registry, Blackwell said. It's effective from the moment of filing. Can it be challenged? It can be brought to the Wizengamot for override, Rake said. But an override requires 2/3 majority, the same as the original constitutional motion. And overriding a pardon would require arguing that the original conviction was legitimate, which it wasn't, because there was no conviction. The argument collapses before it starts. Harry looked at Sirius. I'm going to do this today, he said. Unless you have an objection. Sirius looked at him across the kitchen table for a moment. He had the expression he got sometimes, still, when things happened that he hadn't had time to brace for, the residual Azkaban reflex of being caught off guard, still slightly too raw to manage smoothly. He blinked it back. No objection, he said, in a voice that was working harder than usual to stay even. No objection at all. Harry got out the decree parchment that Blackwell had pre-prepared for exactly this purpose, dipped the quill, and wrote Sirius's name and the formal language of the pardon in the clear, compact handwriting that 8 years of doing schoolwork alone in a cupboard had produced. He pressed all 4 rings to the base of the document simultaneously, the way Blackwell had demonstrated. The parchment warmed. The imprint of 4 seals appeared in the lower corner, gold, silver dark, stone grey, blue-threaded bronze, and they fused into a single mark that was all 4 at once and recognizably none of them separately, the way harmonics blend into a chord. Rake took it to the registry that afternoon. Sirius didn't say anything about it. He went upstairs after the meeting ended and Harry heard him in the room above the kitchen, moving around, and after a while it went quiet, and Harry sat at the table with Fleamont Potter's portrait, which he'd brought from the manor and temporarily hung in the kitchen, because the manor wasn't habitable yet, and talked about his grandmother, about the ring's history, about what Fleamont knew of the Peverell line, which turned out to be considerable. At some point, without making an announcement about it, Sirius came back downstairs, made 2 cups of tea, put one in front of Harry, and sat down. They didn't talk about the pardon. They talked about the manor restoration, and the constitutional briefing, and whether Creature was capable of producing a meal he wasn't furious about, which Harry thought probably not and Sirius thought was actually an interesting experimental question. It was fine. The first attack came from Umbridge, as expected, though the form of it was more creative than Harry had anticipated. It arrived as a ministry circular, distributed to all Wizengamot members and flagged as urgent, from the office of the Undersecretary to the Minister, a formal petition requesting that the Wizengamot's Educational Standards Review Board be granted oversight authority over the early education of any minor holding a constitutional title, on the basis that the stability of magical Britain's governance required assurance that its constitutional monarch was receiving appropriate magical and civic instruction. In plain language, a mechanism for the ministry to control what Harry learned and who taught him. McGonagall brought it to Grimmauld Place on a Wednesday morning, moving through the front door with the specific energy she had when she was containing irritation at a high level. She put it on the kitchen table without comment and stood with her arms folded while Harry read it. He read it twice. "She's on the review board," Harry said. "She chairs the review board," McGonagall said, with a flatness that contained 30 years of professional opinion about Dolores Umbridge compressed into 7 words. "Who else is on it?" 3 ministry appointees, all of whom are directly or indirectly in her orbit. 1 independent, a retired Hogwarts governor named Tiberius Ogden, who we know. A pause. And 1 Wizengamot member, who is supposed to be a neutral representative and is currently Lucius Malfoy. Harry looked up from the circular. "Malfoy is on the Educational Review Board. He was appointed before the full sitting," McGonagall said. "Before he knew you were who you were. He's been on it for 18 months. Harry thought about that. The bronze ring arranged it alongside the conversation in the ministry corridor, alongside Malfoy's warning about Umbridge, alongside the question he'd asked, "What would it take for your political position to not require my political failure?" "Can I call a meeting of the review board?" he asked. McGonagall blinked. "As High King you can compel attendance from any ministry body." "Yes." "Set one up," Harry said. "The full board. Include Malfoy. This week if possible." "Harry," McGonagall started. "She wants oversight of my education," Harry said. "I'll give her a meeting. That's what oversight bodies do, they have meetings." He looked up at McGonagall. "But I'll be running the meeting." The review board met in a ministry conference room on the 4th floor on Friday afternoon. Tiberius Ogden was there, short and amiable, with the look of a man genuinely pleased to be summoned somewhere interesting. The 3 ministry appointees were there, all of them the precise bureaucratic shape of people who were ambitious and not quite talented enough to be ambitious without support, and whose support was obvious. Malfoy was there, in grey robes, at the far end of the table, watching Harry's entrance with that careful, recalibrating attention. Umbridge was there. Harry had read about her. McGonagall had described her. Malfoy had warned him about her. None of those things had fully prepared him for the experience of being in the same room as Dolores Umbridge, which had a specific quality that Harry catalogued and filed immediately. She was the most dangerous person he'd been in a room with yet, not because of power, but because of the combination of certainty and smallness. She was absolutely certain she was right. She was also, in some fundamental way, not interested in anyone who disagreed. That combination, in a person with institutional power and patience, was more threatening than anything Malfoy had brought to the Wizengamot chamber. She smiled at Harry when he walked in. "Lord Potter," she said, in a voice that was warm and soft and had a quality of sweetness over something entirely unlike sweetness. "How lovely. We're so glad you've taken an interest in this process." "I have some questions about the petition," Harry said, and sat down. He didn't match her warmth and he didn't match it coldly. He just didn't engage with it, which he'd found was the most efficient response to social performances you had no intention of participating in. He opened his notes. "The petition requests oversight authority over my education on the grounds of," I'm quoting, "ensuring the stability of magical Britain's governance." He looked up. Can you define specifically what you mean by stability? Umbridge's smile didn't move. Well, of course we mean, I'd like a specific answer, Harry said. What educational outcomes, specifically, does the review board consider essential for the constitutional monarch? What curriculum? What instructors? What assessment criteria? A brief pause. These are matters the board would determine through its oversight process, Umbridge said, with the pleasant implacability of someone who has spent years answering questions with the word process. So the oversight body would determine the criteria for the oversight, Harry said. That's circular. Lord Potter, I think perhaps, the petition as written, Rake said, from beside Harry, contains no specific educational standards, no defined curriculum, and no assessment criteria. It grants the board unlimited discretionary authority over Lord Potter's education with no limiting principle and no review mechanism. She had a copy of the petition open in front of her. It is not an educational oversight document. It is a guardianship document, and it conflicts directly with the Wisengamot trust arrangement already in place and with the constitutional status recognized at the full sitting. The three ministry appointees were looking between Umbridge and Harry with the expressions of people who had come expecting a procedural meeting and had found something considerably more active. Umbridge's smile thinned by a fraction. With respect to Lord Potter's solicitor, do you have children, Madam Umbridge? Harry asked. She blinked. The question had come from the wrong direction. I ask because the petition frames itself as being in my interest, Harry said. In the interest of a minor. And I'm wondering whether the experience of actually raising a child informs that framing or whether it's primarily, he paused, as if searching for the word. Theoretical. The room went still in a specific way. Not shocked, too controlled for shock. But still. Umbridge looked at him with an expression in which the smile was entirely absent and what was underneath was briefly visible, and what Harry saw in it was not anger. It was colder than anger. It was the look of a person who has just added a name to a list they keep internally and are very patient about. He'd expected that. He noted it and kept going. The petition is invalid, he said, looking around the table now. If the board wants to propose an educational framework, I'm happy to discuss specific proposals with specific criteria. That's a reasonable thing for this body to do. He looked at Ogden, who was watching proceedings with the expression of a man both entertained and impressed. But this petition doesn't propose a framework. It claims authority. Those are different things, and I'm not going to sign off on the latter as though it's the former. He looked at Malfoy. Malfoy had been watching from the end of the table with the careful stillness of someone who had walked into a situation expecting one thing and was reassessing its speed. His eyes met Harry's briefly. Lord Malfoy, Harry said. You've been on this board for 18 months. In your experience, has it ever produced specific, measurable educational standards for any of its oversight subjects? A pause. No, Malfoy said, with the flat precision of someone answering a question honestly because the alternative is being caught answering it dishonestly. It has not. Umbridge's gaze moved to Malfoy with a sharpness that lasted less than a second but which Harry caught and filed. Then I'd suggest the board reform itself before expanding its authority, Harry said. He closed his notes. I'm glad to work with a board that has actual standards and actual criteria. I'll give you 30 days to produce a specific proposal. He stood. If a proposal isn't submitted in 30 days, I'll treat the petition as withdrawn. He looked at Umbridge one more time. Thank you for the meeting. He walked out. McGonagall was in the corridor, where she'd been waiting because the meeting was technically internal ministry business and she hadn't been on the formal invitation list, and she fell into step beside Harry without comment until they'd rounded the first corner. The 30-day ultimatum, she said. She won't produce a proposal, Harry said. She doesn't want standards. She wants authority. And when she doesn't produce one? Then I table a royal decree establishing my own educational framework, Harry said. Specific curriculum, chosen instructors, measurable outcomes. Including, he glanced at her sideways. Hogwarts, 2 years ahead of schedule, if we can arrange it. McGonagall stopped walking. Harry stopped too and looked at her. You want to start Hogwarts early, she said. I want to learn magic, Harry said, with the simplicity of someone who has wanted something for a long time and has stopped finding it necessary to apologize for wanting it. Properly. I've been doing theory and law and politics for 4 months. I'd like to do something practical. He paused. And Hogwarts is the best place in Britain to do it. You're the deputy headmistress. Dumbledore is, he paused. Complicated, but not opposed to my interests. And if I'm there, I'm harder to target through educational oversight petitions. McGonagall looked at him for a long moment. The ministry corridor hummed its institutional hum around them. I'll speak to Albus, she said. Thank you, Harry said. They walked toward the lifts. You handled Umbridge well, McGonagall said, and it was clearly costing her something to say it because it involved acknowledging that a 9-year-old had managed a room that adults regularly found unmanageable. The question about children was, it landed, Harry said. It landed, she confirmed. You're going to need to be careful with her. She's patient. I know, Harry said. So am I. The second attack was Dumbledore's, and it was the harder one because it came from Care. He arrived at Grimmauld Place on a Sunday evening, unannounced, which Harry suspected was itself a statement, a test of whether he'd be turned away at the door, which he wasn't, because Harry had been expecting it and had decided weeks ago that he was not going to win this particular relationship through avoidance. Creature answered the door with the specific displeasure of a house elf confronted with someone he recognized from previous, less happy times. Dumbledore stepped inside with the slightly careful posture of a man who respected someone else's house, and Sirius came out of the kitchen, and the two of them looked at each other in the entrance hall for a moment that had several decades of complicated history inside it. Sirius, Dumbledore said, quietly. Albus, Sirius said. His voice was even. He's in the study. Dumbledore came to the study, which had been the room Harry had restored first because it was intact and had bookshelves, and the chair behind the desk felt, when he sat in it, like the chair behind a desk should feel. He was going through correspondence when Dumbledore knocked and came in, and he put the letters down and gestured to the chair on the other side of the desk. Dumbledore sat. He looked around the room with an expression that took its time, at the bookshelves, at the Fleamont portrait Harry had temporarily moved in here, at the 4 rings on Harry's hands, at Harry himself. You've been busy, Dumbledore said. Yes, Harry said. I received the pardon decree filing, Dumbledore said. Regarding Sirius. You were Chief Warlock when he was taken to Azkaban, Harry said. I thought you should see it. Something moved in Dumbledore's face. I deserve that, he said, quietly. I did. I want to say, he stopped. Started again. I have thought, in the weeks since the vault records were presented at the hearing, a great deal about what I believed I was doing with that money and what I was actually doing, and those two things are, he was quiet for a moment. Further apart than I had told myself. Where did it go? Harry asked. Not as an accusation. As a question. A fund for war orphans, Dumbledore said. Genuinely. Families who lost parents in the conflict and had nothing. I told myself that you had everything you needed at the Dursleys and that the money was doing more good. He stopped. I didn't verify what you had at the Dursleys. I should have. The first time I didn't, I told myself it was because you were safe and there were more urgent things. The second time it was the same. By the third, not checking had become the habit. He looked at Harry with eyes that were not asking for forgiveness and not defending the choice. I am not telling you this to excuse it. I'm telling you because you asked and because you deserve the truth. Harry looked at him for a long moment. The gold ring was warm. Not with anger. The War Orphan Fund, Harry said. How many families did it support? Dumbledore blinked. At its peak, 43 families. Now 12 still draw from it. I want the full accounting, Harry said. Not for legal action. Because if it did what you say, the fund should continue and probably expand. He paused. I have resources now. I'd rather they go somewhere useful than sit in a vault. Dumbledore was very still. Harry, he said, and the warmth in his voice was real and heavy with something that was not pride exactly but was in the family of it. That is, it's practical, Harry said. Don't make it into something else. He looked at Dumbledore steadily. I'm not angry with you. I was, briefly, when I first understood the full picture. But anger is expensive and I have things to spend my attention on. He paused. What I need from you is honest. No managing. If you have concerns, say them directly. If you disagree with something I'm doing, tell me why. Don't steer. Don't arrange things from a distance and hope the outcome is what you intended. Dumbledore looked at him for a long, specific moment. You sound very like your mother, he said. I know, Harry said. She was right about most things, from what I hear. Something happened in Dumbledore's expression, something deep and old and briefly unguarded, the grief of a man who had loved two people very much and lost them in the same night and spent 9 years carrying that. She was right about nearly everything, he said. The Horcruxes, Harry said. It landed like a stone in still water. Dumbledore went very still. The quality of stillness was different from Malfoy's stillness was controlled preparation. This was the stillness of someone who has just had a private room open from the outside. You know about those, Dumbledore said. Not a question. I worked it out, Harry said. Voldemort split his soul. The night in Godric's Hollow, whatever happened when my mother's sacrifice deflected the killing curse, it destroyed his body but not whatever he'd tethered himself to. He's still present. Quirrell. He watched Dumbledore's face. I've been watching the reports about Quirrell for 3 months. Something is wrong with him. The way he presents in public has changed. He's avoiding certain situations. The Gringotts break-in attempt in July, how do you know about that? Dumbledore said quietly. Gringotts director's office, Harry said. Ragnarok told me. Someone tried to break into Vault 613 in July, failed because the vault had already been emptied that morning, and the security footage showed a man who moved like Quirrell but with a quality of presence that doesn't fit someone with Quirrell's history. He paused. What's in Vault 613? A long pause. Something I moved, Dumbledore said. Because I believed someone would try to take it. He looked at Harry. The Philosopher's Stone. Nicholas Flamels. And Voldemort wants it, Harry said. Because the stone produces the elixir of life and he needs a body. He worked through it aloud, the way the bronze ring encouraged. He's been at Hogwarts all year. Closer to the stone. And you've been watching him, managing the situation, managing it, yes, Dumbledore said, with a very slight, very honest emphasis on the word that was almost self-mockery. Setting protections. Waiting. He looked at Harry. I had anticipated that if he made a move, I would be positioned to stop it. And if you weren't there? Harry said. Silence. The protections would slow him, Dumbledore said, carefully. Slow him isn't stop him, Harry said. You're going to be in London for the Christmas governor's meeting, I saw it in the Hogwarts schedule that McGonagall gave me. That's 2 weeks away. If he moves while you're gone, Harry, Dumbledore said. You are 9 years old. You keep saying that, Harry said, pleasantly. And I keep noting that it hasn't changed the situation yet. He leaned forward slightly. I'm not proposing to fight Voldemort. I'm proposing that we stop leaving windows open for him. He paused. Move the stone again. Somewhere he can't find it. Or, he thought about it. Give it back to Flamel. He's lived 600 years without the Ministry knowing where he kept it. He's presumably managed. Dumbledore looked at him. The fire in the study grate crackled. The Fleamont portrait in the corner was watching both of them with the attentive silence of someone who understood they were witnessing something important. "I'll speak to Nicholas," Dumbledore said at last. "Tomorrow." "Thank you," Harry said. "You are," Dumbledore started, and stopped, and seemed to choose a different word from the one he'd been reaching for. "Very much yourself," he said. "Which is not what I expected. And considerably better than what I was afraid of." "What were you afraid of?" Harry asked. "A child crushed by weight he didn't choose," Dumbledore said, quietly. "Or, worse, one hardened by it into something cold." He looked at Harry. "You are neither." "Not yet," Harry said. "No," Dumbledore said, with something in his voice that was cautious and warm at once. "Not yet. Which means we have work to do to keep it that way." Harry said. "If you'll allow it," Dumbledore said, and it was genuine. The offer of someone who understood they were asking rather than directing. Harry thought about it. He thought about what McGonagall had said, "He loves you. And he's wrong about things. Both are true at once." He thought about the War Orphan Fund. He thought about the specific quality of a man who makes mistakes and doesn't pretend otherwise. "Yes," he said. "On the condition you tell me things directly. All of it. Even the parts you think I'm too young for." "Agreed," Dumbledore said. "Starting with everything you know about the Horcruxes," Harry said. "How many, where you think they are, and what it takes to destroy them." Dumbledore was quiet for a moment. Then he reached into his robes, produced a small leather notebook, and put it on the desk between them. "I have been compiling this," he said, "for several years. My research and my theories." He looked at Harry. "They are incomplete. Some may be wrong." "I'll tell you which ones," Harry said. Dumbledore looked at him, and there was something in his expression that was, finally, genuinely uncomplicated, a kind of relief, old and deep, the relief of someone who has been carrying something alone for a long time and has just been offered help. "I believe you will," he said. The third attack came from the old families, and it was the strangest. A delegation, formally organized, presented itself at Grimmauld Place on a Thursday morning. 7 witches and wizards, representing 7 ancient and noble houses that had not declared for or against at the full sitting. They had an appointed speaker, Lord Septimus Knott, thin and precise and somewhere in his 60s, with the manner of a man who had decided to take this meeting seriously and was communicating that decision through posture alone. They wanted to know if the High King title was going to mean anything in practice or whether it was going to be ceremonial. Harry appreciated the directness. He sat them in the drawing room, which Creature had prepared with aggressive magnificence, as though daring the guests to be unimpressed, and he said, "What specifically are you concerned about?" What came out over the next 2 hours was more interesting than the Wisengamot hearing had been, because it was honest in a way that political theater wasn't. The 7 families had concerns that were specific and historical, about whether old treaty obligations between their houses and the crown would be acknowledged, about what the king's peace provision actually meant for disputes between families that the ministry had been refusing to arbitrate properly for years, about whether the constitutional monarchy was going to end up being the ministry's instrument or something genuinely independent. That last concern was the one Harry focused on. "The independence is structural," he said. "The title supersedes ministry authority in constitutional matters. That's not my preference, it's the charter. If the ministry tries to use me as an instrument, the same structural protection applies in the other direction." He looked at Knott. "What specifically has the ministry been refusing to arbitrate?" Knott produced a list. Harry took it and read it with the full attention of the bronze ring, and what he found was, not surprising, exactly, but clarifying. 17 ongoing disputes between old families, some of them a decade or more old, that had been sitting in ministry queue essentially indefinitely. Not because they were complicated, but because none of the parties involved were connected enough to have them moved forward. The ministry arbitrated what it was pressured to arbitrate. I can compel arbitration, Harry said. That's within the title's scope. I'll do it for every dispute on this list, in sequence, starting next month. He looked around the room. What I need in exchange is straightforward. When we go back to the Wisengamot for the next major vote, and there will be one, probably in spring, I need your house's votes on the right side. Nott looked at him. What will the vote be? A civil rights decree that formalizes several protections that should already exist and don't, Harry said. Muggle-born witches and wizards, half-bloods, magical creatures with recognized intelligence, people the current system disenfranchises. The decree will establish minimum legal protections. He paused. These are not controversial positions if you believe in rule of law. They're only controversial if you don't. Nott was quiet for a moment. Some of the families I'm speaking for will find that difficult, he said, with an honesty that Harry respected. I know, Harry said. I'm not asking for enthusiasm. I'm asking for votes. You can vote in favor and have private reservations. He paused. I'm 9. I'm not in a position to reform everyone's beliefs. I'm in a position to move the legal structures. Nott looked at him for a long time. Then he glanced at the other 6, and what passed between them in that glance was the particular silent communication of people who have known each other long enough to not need words. The disputes, first, Nott said. We'll see how you handle the first 3. Then we'll talk about the vote. Fair enough, Harry said. He showed them out himself. Sirius, who had been in the kitchen and had heard everything through the door and had not been subtle about it, appeared in the hallway when Harry came back in. Not, Sirius said. His voice was neutral in the way of someone exerting effort toward neutral. He was honest, Harry said. His son is going to be at Hogwarts when you start, Sirius said. His politics are his father's. His father's politics are currently negotiable, Harry said. The son's might be too, given time. He looked at Sirius. I can't only work with people who already agree with me. Sirius was quiet for a moment. Your father would have thrown him out on principle, he said. Not as a criticism. More as an observation. My father died at 21, Harry said, gently. Sirius flinched. Just slightly. Just the expression. I'm sorry, Harry said, immediately. No, Sirius said. You're right. And he ran a hand through his hair. I'm still catching up. Still finding the difference between the world I left and the one I'm in. He looked at Harry. You're already in this one, aren't you? It's the only one I've got, Harry said. Sirius let out a breath. Right, he said. Then, Creature made lunch. It involves approximately 17 types of food that he's angry about making and which are going to be magnificent. Harry walked with him back to the kitchen, and behind them the drawing room was quiet and the old house settled into its new shape again, and outside in the December street of Grimmauld Place the grey London sky sat above everything, and somewhere to the north the foundations of Potter Manor were being cleaned and reinforced and brought back toward habitable, and the work continued in all its forms. And Harry Potter ate lunch and thought about spring and all the things that still needed doing before it. Chapter 6, The King's Peace. The thing about Voldemort, Harry had decided, was that everyone who'd faced him had made the same mistake. They'd been afraid first. Not the rational, information-based caution that you applied to any dangerous situation, that was fine, that was necessary. But the specific, preemptive terror that preceded any actual encounter, the way the name alone could silence a room and make grown people flinch, the way the narrative had been constructed so carefully over 20 years that his mere existence was a weapon. Every person who'd gone up against him had already half lost before anything happened, because the story they'd been told was, this is something that cannot be faced. Harry had never been told that story. He'd been told his parents died in a car crash. By the time he learned the truth, he'd had the rings for months, and the rings didn't do terror. The stone ring in particular had a quality, when he thought about death, Voldemort specifically, Voldemort as an embodied threat to his life, that was less like courage and more like clarity. A kind of flat, clean-eyed understanding that death existed, that it had come for his family, and that it was a fact about the world rather than a verdict. He thought about all of this on the train back from London to Little Whinging on a Tuesday in early February, which was also the day he worked out where Quirrell was going to make his move and when. He'd been tracking it through Dumbledore's notebook and his own observations and the reports McGonagall passed to him from Hogwarts staff, and the pattern had been assembling itself for weeks, the way patterns did when you paid the kind of attention the bronze ring demanded. Quirrell was deteriorating. Whatever sustained a soul fragment required effort, and the effort was showing. The stutter was worse, the absences more frequent, the behavior more erratic. He was being pushed toward action by the thing riding him, and the thing riding him had been patient for months and was running out of patience. The Philosopher's Stone had been moved. Dumbledore had spoken to Flamel 3 days after their study conversation, and the stone had left Hogwarts in a lockbox by owl courier to an address Harry had deliberately not asked for. That part of the problem was solved. But Voldemort didn't know that yet. Which meant Quirrell was going to go for the stone at the first opportunity, and he was going to find an empty vault and a trail that led nowhere, and the question Harry had been sitting with was, what happened then? A cornered fragment of a Dark Lord's soul, in the body of a man it had been slowly destroying for months, with no object to acquire and nowhere to go, that was less predictable than a straightforward theft attempt. That was something that might do anything. Harry got off the train at Little Whinging Station and stood on the platform for a moment in the February cold, thinking about this, and then he took out the small enchanted communication parchment he'd been using to correspond with Dumbledore and wrote, "He'll move soon. The stone being gone won't stop him, it'll destabilize him. We should talk." The parchment warmed and wrote back within minutes, "Come to Hogwarts. This weekend." Harry wrote back, "I'll be there Saturday." He put the parchment in his pocket and walked home through streets he was going to leave soon, permanently, and felt nothing particular about it. Potter Manor was habitable by the first week of March. Not finished, the upper floors were still being worked on and the grounds were a long-term project, but the ground floor, for bedrooms, the kitchen, the study and the library were solid and clean and recognizably a home. The restoration architects had done something that Harry hadn't been able to articulate as a requirement but which they'd somehow understood anyway. They'd fixed what was broken without erasing what it had been. The scar in the northeast corner of the entrance hall was still there, smoothed and filled but visible, because Harry had told them to leave it. Sirius had stood in the entrance hall on the day they moved in and looked at that scar for a long time without speaking. Then he'd gone to the kitchen and made tea, and when Harry came in he handed him a cup and said, "Your grandmother's recipe. Fleamont's portrait told me." "I didn't know portraits could teach cooking," Harry said. "Apparently he's been wanting to share it for 9 years, Sirius said. "We were just the first ones to hang him in a kitchen." The Fleamont portrait had been given a permanent spot on the kitchen wall, which he seemed to consider his appropriate station and from which he dispensed opinions on a wide variety of subjects with the cheerful unsolicited energy of someone who had been waiting to talk to family for a very long time. McGonagall came by the weekend after they moved in, walked through the restored rooms with an expression that cycled through several things before settling on something quiet and private that she didn't comment on, and said, "Your parents would have been glad to see it standing." "I know," Harry said. She nodded once, then said, "Hogwarts. Dumbledore has agreed. September, subject to your formal enrollment, which I'll handle." She paused. 2 years early, technically. But the extenuating circumstances are documented. "Is there going to be resistance from the governors?" Harry asked. "There was," McGonagall said. "There isn't now." She didn't elaborate, and Harry decided the specifics of that conversation were probably a gift he didn't need to examine too closely. "What house do you think I'll be in?" he asked. McGonagall looked at him with the particular expression of someone who has a strong opinion and is deciding whether to share it. "The Sorting Hat makes its own decisions," she said, with great care. "Gryffindor or Ravenclaw," Harry said. "Probably." "Probably," McGonagall said, and turned away to examine a bookshelf with excessive attention. He went to Hogwarts on a Saturday in February, as arranged. Sirius drove him to the train station and walked with him to the platform and stood with his hands in his pockets in the way he had when he was trying to look like something wasn't significant. "You'll be fine," Sirius said. "I know," Harry said. "I'm saying it because, I know," Harry said again, and grinned at him, and Sirius shook his head and grinned back, the full one, the one that still sometimes arrived and surprised both of them with how much of James Potter's best friend was still intact underneath everything Azkaban had taken. The Hogwarts Express wasn't running. It was a Saturday in February, not September, so Harry traveled by Floo from the Leaky Cauldron, which Dumbledore had arranged, and arrived in the headmaster's office in a brief shower of green sparks to find Dumbledore behind his desk and McGonagall in a chair to the left and the various portraits of previous headmasters watching with collective interest. The office was exactly what he'd expected from someone who had clearly never stopped accumulating interesting objects. Every surface had something on it. The sorting hat sat on its shelf. The pensieve was on a side table. A phoenix perched on a stand by the window, watching Harry with amber eyes that were very old and very certain about something. "Fox," Harry said. The phoenix trilled, once, a sound that went through the room and settled in the chest like sunlight. "He likes you," Dumbledore said, with genuine pleasure. "He's quite discriminating." "Hello," Harry told the phoenix, and Fox ruffled his feathers in a way that seemed satisfied. They spent 3 hours talking. Not the careful, politically managed conversation of the study at Grimmauld Place. This was something different. Dumbledore had decided, Harry understood, to do what he'd agreed to do, be honest. He went through the Horcrux research in detail, spreading his notes and Harry's combined notes across the desk and working through them together, two people with different kinds of knowledge and different kinds of experience examining the same problem from their separate angles. Dumbledore knew more than Harry about the dark arts and their specific mechanics. Harry knew more about the current situation, about the political landscape, about the timeline of Quirrell's deterioration, and the bronze ring's pattern recognition combined with Dumbledore's encyclopedic knowledge produced something neither of them had separately. By the end of the 3 hours they had a list, 7 objects, Dumbledore believed, though some were speculation. A diary. A ring, not the ancestral rings, a different one, dangerous. A locket. A cup. A diadem. A snake. And something Dumbledore hesitated over, that he wouldn't name, that made the stone ring pulse with an unusual warmth when Harry sat near the pensieve. "That last one," Harry said, watching Dumbledore's face. "I believe I know what it is," Dumbledore said carefully. "And if I'm right, it changes certain things considerably." He looked at Harry with those very blue eyes. "I need more time with it before I'm prepared to discuss it. Not to manage you, because I promised I wouldn't. But because I don't want to tell you something wrong about something this important." A pause. "Will you allow me that?" Harry thought about it. The stone ring was still warm. The warmth wasn't alarming, it felt more like recognition than warning, the familiar sensation of something at the edge of understanding. 2 weeks, Harry said. Dumbledore nodded. 2 weeks. McGonagall, who had been taking notes with the focused efficiency of someone who had decided to be useful regardless of the existential scale of the conversation, looked up. "Quirrell's next class is Monday. I've been watching him. His dueling demonstration last week," she paused. "The spells he used were not standard curriculum." "Which ones?" Harry asked. She told him. The bronze ring placed them precisely, not inherently dangerous as individual spells, but the specific combination was interesting. Binding, concealment, a notice-me-not in a configuration that suggested practice. "He's been preparing to move through the school undetected," Harry said. "The stone is gone," Dumbledore said. "He doesn't know that," Harry said. "And when he finds out," he looked at Dumbledore. "What's in the mirror?" "The mirror of Eriste. It was one of the protections you set up." Dumbledore looked at him. "How do you know about the mirror?" "Your notebook listed it as one of the obstacles," Harry said. "I wondered what it was protecting." And I looked up erased and found the Latin inversion, and I thought about what an object that shows your deepest desire would be guarding, and, he paused. Where is the stone now? Not the location. Is it gone from the mirror's protection specifically? The mirror was never the stone's resting place, Dumbledore said slowly. It was a test. Only someone who wanted to find the stone but not use it could retrieve it from the mirror. So the mirror is empty now, Harry said. Yes. Harry thought about that. About a shade of Voldemort in a deteriorating host, pushing toward action, finding the stone gone from every location, moving through the school with concealment spells and nowhere left to go, except a mirror that shows you what you most desire. What does Voldemort want most? Harry said. The office went quiet. To live, Dumbledore said. Not as a platitude. As a precise answer. Then the mirror isn't empty, Harry said. Not to him. He goes to the mirror because it's the last thread he has, and he looks into it, and he sees, he thought about it. He sees himself restored. A body. Life. He paused. And then he looks at who's standing in the room with him and he has a choice. Harry, McGonagall said, with the specific tone she used when she was about to say something she found necessary and didn't like. I'm not proposing to go looking for him, Harry said. I'm proposing to be there when he comes. Which is different. He looked at Dumbledore. The mirror room. The third-floor corridor. When does Quirrell have a free period? When is the castle most likely to be quiet? You are not going to, McGonagall started. I'm not going alone, Harry said. Dumbledore. He looked at him. You, me, and McGonagall. All three of us. Not as a trap, as a managed encounter. He paused. The stone is gone. There's nothing to take. What I want is a conversation. The silence in the headmaster's office had a very specific quality. A conversation, Dumbledore said. He's not fully present, Harry said. He's a fragment. He's been trying to reconstitute himself for 2 years off the back of one terrible host. He's weakening. He turned the stone ring on his finger, slowly. I want to see him. I want him to see me. And I want to understand, he paused, reaching for the precise thought. I want to understand whether what happened at Godric's Hollow was a terminus or a beginning. For him or for you? Dumbledore asked, very quietly. Both, Harry said. They said it on a Wednesday night, 2 weeks later. Not because they'd planned the Wednesday specifically, but because Dumbledore came to Harry's flu connection at 8 in the evening with the particular quality of movement that meant something had shifted, and said, he's in the corridor. Now. Harry had been doing homework, actual homework, the kind McGonagall had been setting him in preparation for Hogwarts, which he'd been doing with more genuine interest than was probably normal, and he was in his school clothes, which was fine, and he had the 4 rings on his hands, which was always, and he stepped through the flue behind Dumbledore and arrived in the third-floor corridor of Hogwarts Castle. McGonagall was already there, 30 feet down the corridor, standing outside the door to the forbidden section with her wand in her hand and an expression of absolute composed readiness. The corridor was dark except for the torchlight, and at the far end, past a series of doors that Harry knew from Dumbledore's notebook were the series of protection chambers, there was a quality of light that was wrong, faint, flickering, with a blue-white edge that no torch produced. He's already through the obstacles, Dumbledore said quietly, beside Harry. All of them? Harry said. He was a very talented wizard, Dumbledore said, with a sadness that was too honest to be performance. Before. Then we go in, Harry said. They went in. The mirror room was at the end of the obstacle sequence, the last chamber, high-ceilinged and cold and dominated by the massive ornate mirror that stood on its clawed feet in the center of the floor, its gold frame catching the wrong-colored light. The light was coming from the man standing in front of it. Quirrell. He was thin in a way that was past ordinary thinness, the thinness of something essential being consumed. His robes hung from him. His hands, extended slightly at his sides, had the taut, strained quality of someone maintaining a great effort. He was staring into the mirror. He heard them come in. Or something in him did. He turned. Harry had thought, in the abstract, about what it would feel like to look at Voldemort for the first time. Even in this fragmented, borrowed form, the eyes were the thing, because the eyes looking out from Quirrell's face were not Quirrell's. They were something older and colder and very, very focused, and they found Harry across the chamber with an immediacy that had nothing to do with sight. "Potter," said Quirrell, in a voice that was two voices, Quirrell's faint, frightened undertone, and beneath it something else, something that had been powerful for decades and was now reduced to a whisper that was somehow still the louder of the two. Harry walked into the room until he was perhaps 20 feet from the mirror. Dumbledore and McGonagall came in behind him. He felt the stone ring pulse, steady, measured, not alarmed. "I know what you're looking for," Harry said. His voice was level. "It's not here." Quirrell's head tilted. The wrong eyes examined him. "You moved it." "Yes," Harry said. "Before you were ready to come for it." A pause. Something moved in the borrowed face that was too complex for Quirrell to have produced alone. "You're not afraid," said the voice that wasn't Quirrell's, and it was said the way you might state the boiling point of water, with scientific precision, noting a fact about the world. "No," Harry said. "You should be," said Voldemort's voice. "I killed your parents." "I know," Harry said. "I've thought about that. And I understand that you made a choice that night," Harry said. "The choice made sense to you in the context of what you believed and what you wanted. I'm not saying it was right. I'm saying I understand its logic." He paused. "But the choice also killed itself. The killing curse on my mother's sacrifice created something you didn't plan for, and it destroyed your body and scattered your soul, and you've been a passenger in other people's lives for a decade, which seems to me like a very poor return on a decision." He looked at the face before him steadily. "The stone isn't here. You're not going to get a body tonight. So I'd like to talk instead." The silence in the chamber was absolute. McGonagall, behind him, had not moved. Dumbledore had not moved. Quirrell had not moved, and neither had the thing inside him, and what was in the wrong-colored eyes was not what Harry had expected. He'd expected rage, or the specific contempt of something ancient confronted with something small. Instead what he found was a quality of attention that was entirely focused, the attention of a very intelligent thing that had encountered an unexpected variable and was processing it. "Talk," said Voldemort. "You want to live," Harry said. "That's the core of it. It's been the core of it since before my parents were alive. Everything you built, the power, the followers, the Horcruxes, all of it is infrastructure for the single goal of not dying." He paused. "I'm not going to tell you that's wrong. Wanting to live is not wrong." He turned the stone ring on his finger, slowly, the way he did when he was thinking hard. "But the method you chose created a version of living that isn't. You are a fragment in a damaged host. The other pieces of you are hidden in objects, isolated, not living in any meaningful sense. The thing you built to preserve yourself has instead divided you into pieces, none of which are whole." A long silence. "What is your point, boy?" said Voldemort's voice, and in it, beneath the coldness, was something Harry heard only because the rings were on his hands. A very faint, very deep thing. The sound of someone listening. "My point," Harry said, "is that I'm the person who will be dealing with your legacy for the next 100 years, whether I choose it or not. The Horcruxes will be found and destroyed, Dumbledore and I have already started. The soul fragments will be released." He paused. "I want you to understand that this is not a war I'm conducting against you personally. It's housekeeping. Your choices made a mess that has to be cleaned up. That's not malice. That's just what happens after a fire. You are a child," said Voldemort's voice, and now there was something in it that was, if not respect, at least the appropriate weight given to something unexpected. Yes, Harry said. And you are a fragment in a borrowed body, staring at a mirror that shows you something you can't have, in a room where you've already lost. He kept his voice entirely even. I'm not here to gloat. I'm here because I think there's a version of this that ends with less damage than the one you've been building toward. But that version requires you to stop. Quirrell's body shuddered. The strain of sustaining the dual presence was showing, the hands had begun to shake, and the face was cycling between expressions in a way that suggested the two occupants were in conflict. You cannot offer me terms, Voldemort said. You have nothing I want. I have the rings, Harry said. A beat. The Peverell ring, Voldemort said, and something changed in his voice, a depth, a resonance, old and dark and thoroughly aware. The resurrection stone. I know what it was, Harry said. And I know what it isn't anymore. The version you know about, the version that opens between life and death, that's been resolved. But I carry the Peverell blood and I carry the ring and I have, he paused, feeling carefully along the edge of something he'd been sitting with for weeks, something the stone ring had been doing that he'd been slowly understanding. I have access to something. Between. Not the dead exactly. Not the living. Something in between. He looked at the wrong-colored eyes. I think you know what I mean. Silence. The shades, Voldemort said. Quieter now. The rasp of something genuinely old in the voice. Yes, Harry said. You could call them, Voldemort said, and now the voice had a quality that Harry finally identified, naked, ancient longing. Not for power. Not for life. For something else entirely, something that predated the Horcruxes and the Dark Mark and all of it. You could call, I don't know who, Harry said honestly. I haven't tried yet. But I know the capacity is there. He paused. I'm not offering this as a bribe. I'm telling you what I know. Because I think you have been afraid of death for so long that you've forgotten what's on the other side of it, what might still be there, and that fear has cost you everything that wasn't life. Quirrell's knees buckled. It was not dramatic. Not a collapse, more like the structural failure of something that had been load-bearing beyond its capacity for too long. The shaking hands went flat against the floor as he caught himself, and the light around him flickered, and the wrong-colored eyes were still looking at Harry with the absolute focus of something that had been operating at diminishing capacity for months and was choosing, in what remained, to spend attention on this. You are extraordinary, said Voldemort's voice, and now it was very quiet, almost internal, as though speaking to itself as much as to Harry. I did not plan for you. No, Harry said. You didn't. The Horcruxes, Voldemort said. You'll destroy them. Yes, Harry said. And then? And then what remains of you goes wherever it was supposed to go, Harry said. I can't promise what that is. The stone ring isn't a map. But it's not nothing. He paused. I think, based on what I've been learning, that the soul doesn't actually end. It changes form. What you turned yourself into is the one shape it isn't supposed to take. He held the stone ring up. I don't know what happens when the Horcruxes are gone and the fragment that's in this room is freed too. But I don't believe it's nothing. Quirrell's body was failing visibly. The light was contracting. It hurts, Quirrell said, in Quirrell's own voice, suddenly, faint and exhausted, the voice of a man who had been displaced from his own body for a year and was barely present in it. It hurts all the time. I know, Harry said, and meant it for both of them. The wrong-colored eyes had gone dim. What looked out of them now was less a presence and more a distance, something receding, the way a sound recedes when you move away from its source, still audible but further. You didn't flinch, said the voice, barely audible now. No, Harry said. James didn't either, said Voldemort's voice, and it was almost gone, and in the last of it Harry heard something that he would think about for years without having a perfect word for. Something that was the ghost of what a person had been before they spent their life running from themselves. He didn't flinch. Quirrell fell. Not dead, the flutter of breath was there, and Dumbledore was already moving, his wand producing a cushioning charm that caught Quirrell before he hit the stone floor fully. But the quality of the room changed in the moment of falling, something left it, some pressure Harry hadn't consciously registered until it was gone, and the mirror at the center of the chamber was dark now, no reflection, no light, just plain glass in a gold frame reflecting an empty room. Harry stood in the silence and felt the 4 rings settle on his hands, each one steady, and did not look away from the mirror. Behind him, Dumbledore crouched beside Quirrell with his wand moving in diagnostic patterns, his face doing something very private and very old. McGonagall stood to Harry's left, and when Harry turned to look at her she was looking at him with the expression she had when she'd used up all the words she had for a thing. "He's alive," Dumbledore said quietly. "Quirrell. Disoriented, physically unwell, he'll need care. But alive." A pause. "The presence is gone." "For now," Harry said. "For now," Dumbledore agreed, and there was nothing evasive in it. "The Horcruxes remain." "I know," Harry said. "We'll deal with them." He looked at the mirror one more time. "Not tonight." He walked toward the door, and McGonagall fell in beside him, and the torch light made their shadows long ahead of them, and behind them Dumbledore spoke quietly to the fallen body of Quirinus Quirrell who had been nobody's enemy and had simply been in the wrong place when something vast and broken had needed somewhere to live. They sat in the headmaster's office until 3 in the morning. Fawkes sang, softly, the kind of song that wasn't for performance, just the baseline sound of something ancient and present, keeping the room company. The portraits of former headmasters were awake and silent, which was unusual enough to be its own kind of commentary. Dumbledore had tea, which materialized from somewhere with the facility of a man who had been running on tea and certainty for 60 years. McGonagall had accepted a cup with the air of someone who had decided that tonight qualified as a tea situation of the highest order. Harry had his hands wrapped around his cup and was looking at the stone ring. "The shades," Dumbledore said, gently. "What you told him, was that true?" "You can access, I don't know," Harry said. "I think so. I've felt it there." "I haven't tried." He looked up. "I was telling him what I knew, not what I'd done." "And was it a tactic?" Dumbledore asked. "Not critically. Genuinely." Harry thought about that honestly. "Partly," he said. "It worked, he listened to me because he heard something he wanted. But it was also just, true. I think." He turned the ring. "I've been afraid to try." "That's allowed," McGonagall said, quietly and firmly, from her chair, in the tone of someone who has been watching a 9-year-old do extraordinary things and has decided to state at least once that he is permitted to find some things difficult. "Yes," Harry said. "I know." "The Horcruxes," Dumbledore said, and opened his notebook. "Now that the diary," he paused. "I believe I know where the diary is. It's in Malfoy's possession, which will make retrieval complicated." "Less complicated than you think," Harry said. "We have the civil rights decree going to the Wizengamot in March. Malfoy needs something to protect his position ahead of that vote. I've been thinking about what I could offer him." "You're going to ask Malfoy for the diary," McGonagall said. "I'm going to offer him the thing he asked me about in the Ministry corridor," Harry said. "He asked what it would take for his political position to not require my political failure." He looked at Dumbledore. "I've been thinking about that question for 2 months. He built his position during the war, and the war's over, and the world I'm building is going to make his position structurally irrelevant unless he adapts to it." He paused. "The adaptation costs him less than he thinks. And in exchange, he gives up the diary," Dumbledore said. "Without knowing it's a Horcrux," Harry said. "To him it's a dangerous dark object he's been sitting on for years, which is a liability. I frame it as a good faith gesture toward cooperation and give him something he actually needs, which is a guaranteed seat on the King's Advisory Council and formal recognition that House Malfoy's support of the Civil Rights Decree will be noted." He paused. "He gets to be on the right side of history by choice rather than necessity. People with his kind of pride care about that. Dumbledore was looking at him with the expression he got sometimes that Harry had finally categorized, the expression of someone who keeps expecting to be the most strategically intelligent person in the room and keeps not being. Your mother, Dumbledore said. I know, Harry said. She would also have done that, Dumbledore said. In exactly that sequence. She would also have worried less about it than she should have and slept perfectly well afterward. Harry smiled, a real one, the kind that arrived without announcement. I'll sleep fine, he said. McGonagall made a sound that was supposed to be disapproval and was mostly affection. Spring came to Potter Manor with a thoroughness that suggested the house had been waiting for it. The gardens, which the restoration team had finally gotten to in late February, turned out to contain serious intentions under the weeds, formal beds that had been planted by someone who knew what they were doing, and which came back with the spring in layered color that started with snowdrops and moved through crocuses and into something more elaborate. Sirius walked through them on the first genuinely warm morning in March and pointed out which plants were which turned out to be something he knew a surprising amount about. James's mum, he said, deadheading something purple with the ease of someone who had done it before. She was serious about gardens. She had strong opinions about most things, Fleamont said, from the kitchen window, which was open. He had strong opinions about being involved in outdoor conversations from indoors. Strong is one word, Sirius said, and looked briefly like himself at 21, and then he caught Harry watching him and the grin shifted into something more present, more the Sirius he was becoming rather than the Sirius he was remembering. The Wizengamot vote on the civil rights decree went 49 to 22, with the Knot block delivering as promised after Harry had cleared the first 3 family disputes in February with a speed and decisiveness that had apparently surprised them and shouldn't have. Lucius Malfoy voted in favor. He also, 2 days before the vote, came to Potter Manor alone, no wife, no associates, with a plain wooden box and the expression of a man who had made a decision he found uncomfortable and was committed to it regardless. He put the box on the table in the study. Harry opened it. Inside was a diary, worn, black-covered, with T.M. Riddle embossed on the cover in faded gold. I inherited it, Malfoy said. From the war. I've known it was dark since I had it verified. I've been, he paused. Unsure of how to dispose of it safely. He looked at Harry steadily. You're better positioned to ensure it's handled correctly. Yes, Harry said. I am. He looked up from the diary. Thank you, Lord Malfoy. Malfoy inclined his head. The Advisory Council seat, he said. Your name will be submitted formally next week, Harry said. Pending confirmation by the full council, which is a formality. I know it's a formality, Malfoy said, dryly. You run the council. We all run the council, Harry said. That's the point. Something moved in Malfoy's face. You are still extremely inconvenient, he said. I want that on the record. Noted, Harry said. After Malfoy had gone, Sirius appeared in the study doorway, looked at the diary on the desk, and said, Is that, yes, Harry said. And he just, yes. Sirius leaned in the doorway with his arms crossed and the expression of a man recalibrating his worldview for the 4th time that month. Right, he said. I'm going to need more time to adjust to how you operate. You've got months, Harry said. The other Horcruxes will take years. Years, Sirius said. Dumbledore and I have a system, Harry said. We're being methodical. He looked up. Will you help with the next one? It's a locket. Dumbledore thinks it's in the Black family vault. Sirius was quiet for a moment. The Black family vault, he said, with a specific flatness. I know, Harry said. You don't have to. I'll do it, Sirius said, with the quality he had when he decided something and wasn't interested in discussing the emotional weight of it further. Obviously I'll do it. He went back to the kitchen. Harry heard him talking to Fleamont's portrait about something that had nothing to do with Horcruxes, the easy conversation of two people who had found each other at the intersection of grief and time and had made something useful of it. The last thing Harry did, on a Thursday at the end of March, was one he'd been sitting with since the day Ragnarok had first said the words civil rights and personal liberty. He drafted the decree himself, without Blackwell and Rake's help. They proofread it afterward and added 3 clauses he'd missed, and it was 3 pages and very precise, because precision was what the bronze ring demanded and what the moment deserved. It established formal legal equality for Muggle-born witches and wizards, full Wisengamot voting rights, full property rights, recognition of their magical lineage as legitimate regardless of birth. It established legal personhood for magical creatures assessed as cognitively equivalent to witches and wizards, with a specific list of assessment criteria that Dumbledore had helped him develop. It established an independent civil review body, separate from the ministry, with authority to investigate violations of the decree's provisions. And at the end, almost as a coda, it contained a single paragraph that he'd written last and had been the truest to write: by royal decree under the authority of the High King's Charter, the King's peace is hereby declared to apply equally to all persons living within the boundaries of magical Britain, regardless of birth, blood, creature status, or origin. No distinction in the eyes of the Crown shall be made on the basis of those characteristics. The peace is not partial. The peace is for everyone. He pressed all 4 rings to the base of it. The seal that formed was the same one that had formed on Sirius's pardon, the 4 combined into one, the cord rather than the individual notes, and it sat in the lower corner of the document and was warm when he touched it. He filed it with the registry on Thursday afternoon, and by Friday morning the Prophet had it on the front page, and by Saturday the owls were coming in from across Britain, families and individuals and groups he'd never heard of, writing to say that the decree had landed, that it had changed something, that they'd woken up Friday morning and the world was different than it had been Thursday night in a specific way that mattered. He read the letters at the kitchen table on Saturday morning with Sirius across from him eating toast and Fleamont's portrait adding commentary from the wall and the spring light coming through the windows of Potter Manor at the angle that meant it was going to be a good day. He was 9 years old. He would be 9 years old for 5 more months. He had a godfather and a professor and a goblin director and a solicitor and a complicated headmaster and a cautious Death Eater turned ally and a house full of good bones and 4 rings on his hands that had been waiting in a root cellar under a dead oak tree for exactly this specific, unlikely, entirely inevitable version of himself to come along and find them. He set the letters down and looked at his hands. Warm, steady, deep, sharp. The rings were quiet this morning. No urgency, no pattern recognition firing, no ancient ancestral weight pressing against the inside of his chest. Just the morning. Just the light. Just the simple, extraordinary fact of being alive and present in a world that was, incrementally, becoming something better. Anything good? Sirius asked, nodding at the stack of letters. Most of it, Harry said. Someone from Diagon Alley wants to know if the decree applies to half-giants. Sirius blinked. Does it? I'm going to say yes, Harry said. You might want to check with Blackwell. I'm the king, Harry said pleasantly. I'll say yes and Blackwell can catch up. Sirius stared at him for a moment, and then he laughed, a real one, the kind that went all the way through, the kind that still arrived sometimes like it was surprised to be there, and Harry watched it and felt the gold ring warm on his finger and thought about James Potter at 21, and about Lily Potter at 21, and about all the things that were still coming, the Horcruxes, the remaining Voldemort fragments, Hogwarts in September, the years of work ahead, and none of it felt like dread. It felt like what it was. It felt like the beginning.